If you are here, you are safe, and you can rest. Welcome, dear traveler. You've arrived at Midnight Documentaries, where each journey is crafted to ease the mind and soften the weight of the day. Tonight, we will walk slowly together into a different kind of story, one that drifts across the boundaries of science, memory, and imagination. This is not a tale to be rushed, nor a lecture to be endured, but rather a soft current to float upon, a long tide of words designed to soothe, to calm, and to quietly lead your thoughts far away from the noise of the present moment. Settle into whatever space you have chosen. Let your body grow heavy and allow your breathing to slow. The world outside can wait. This is your time to rest. Before we begin, just a gentle note. If you would like these quiet journeys to continue, you might consider subscribing to Midnight Documentaries. No pressure, only gratitude for your presence here tonight. In this shared moment of stillness, as you close your eyes, you might feel how the rhythm of your own thoughts begins to match the cadence of the voice that carries you. A slower pace, a calmer tide, each word arriving like a wave that touches the shore and then retreats, leaving nothing urgent behind. Perhaps you imagine yourself lying beneath a wide, starry sky where the silence of night deepens around you. Or perhaps you see yourself standing at the edge of a vast ocean, the horizon so wide it seems to fold back upon itself. Either way, the invitation is simple. Let go and drift. And while you drift, we will wonder together. Because the Earth you know, with its 7 continents scattered like puzzle pieces across the oceans, has not always been this way. There was a time, far back in the long chapters of deep history, when all the lands were joined, when mountains touched mountains across what are now oceans, and when rivers stretched unbroken across a single world. That world has a name, Pangea. But before we rush toward that name, it is worth pausing. Consider the world beneath your feet as it exists right now. Continents seem still, oceans appear eternal, and mountains look immovable. Yet in truth, nothing here is fixed. The ground beneath us is always moving, though so slowly that a human life cannot feel it. Perhaps you sense it now. The world as a restless being, breathing through stone, shifting in silence. If the land itself is never still, then how different might it have been, millions upon millions of years ago, when its story was written differently? Tonight, we will not chase that story as one might chase facts in a textbook. Instead, we will let the questions guide us. What was Earth like during Pangea? And just as important, what if Earth had never broken apart at all? What would it mean for life, for climate, for the very shape of memory written in the rocks? These questions cannot be answered with certainty, yet they can be held gently, as one holds a stone picked up on a quiet walk, something small, smooth, and full of hidden time. To imagine Pangea is to imagine a world where distance was folded inward, where the land was not a scattering but a gathering. Oceans, smaller then, clustered around the edges. The heart of the world was dry, vast, and silent. Perhaps, if you walked across it, you would wander for months without reaching the sea. Imagine that horizon. Endless dunes under a copper sun, wind carving lines in the sand like a calligraphy only time could write. You might think it lonely, but maybe it was not. Maybe it was full of voices. The low hum of life, still small, still searching, but already enduring. And yet, if you walked further, you would have found forests rising against the sky, ancient trees that have no direct descendant today. You would have seen rivers cutting their paths like silver threads, carrying silt, carrying memory, across a land without borders. The earth then was both strange and familiar, both alien and intimate. It was the same ground, the same air, and yet arranged in a way that feels like a dream. Perhaps you are drifting already, and that is fine. If your thoughts blur, know that you can let them. This journey does not demand full attention. It welcomes half-closed eyes, drifting minds, and gentle breaths. If you wake later, the Earth will still be here, and the story will still be waiting. Deep time has patience. What is most important now is not to know every detail, but to feel the scale. To remember that Earth has carried many faces, and that ours is only one among them. Time as an editor, continents as lines on a page, oceans as spaces between. And in one chapter, long before the world looked as it does today, all the pieces were gathered as one. Pangea, a word like a spell, a name that means all Earth. It is there, in that single word, that our wandering begins. There is a moment, somewhere between waking thought and drifting dream, where the mind catches a question and holds it gently, turning it over as though it were a seashell found at the edge of the tide. Perhaps you feel that moment now. The question is vast, older than memory, and yet it rests lightly in your palm. What was Earth like during Pangea? It is not a small question. It is a door into a room we cannot step inside, yet we can lean against the frame and imagine the air within. To picture Pangea is to reach across hundreds of millions of years, into a time before human story, before cities, before even the mountains we know. To think of it is to let the world rearrange itself in the mind's eye, not as a globe scattered with continents, but as a single body, joined together. We are used to seeing Earth as a puzzle with broken pieces, a map unrolled on a classroom wall, seas dividing the land into familiar shapes: Africa, Asia, the Americas, Australia, Europe. Each has its own edges, coastlines like signatures written in stone. Oceans form the vast space between them, and in those waters we see separation, difference, individuality. But Pangea asks us to imagine another view, to press the pieces of the puzzle back together until they lock, snug as bones in a skeleton. The Atlantic gone, the Indian vanished, the world's edges touching like long-forgotten friends reunited. And what then? What would it have felt like to stand at the heart of such a land? To wake in the morning and know that no ocean lay between you and the furthest horizon? Perhaps the winds would have carried a different weight, sweeping uninterrupted across plains that stretched for thousands of miles. Perhaps storms would have rolled like restless nomads, unhindered by seas, their voices echoing over one unbroken landmass. But here is the inversion, the gentle tilting of the lens. We can ask, what was Earth like when the continents were one? And we can ask its shadow twin, what if Earth had never broken apart? If Pangea had remained whole, would history itself have followed another path? Would creatures have evolved differently, never divided by the waters? Would civilizations one day have grown without oceans to separate them, humanity rising as a single culture, rooted in one land? It is a thought experiment, fragile and unanswerable, yet it stirs something in us, the way all impossible questions do. Consider today's Earth. We know its geography by heart. The globe spinning with water as its skin, continents floating like islands. We have grown used to division, to the way seas define our maps and our lives. Our myths, our wars, our trade routes, all shaped by the blue stretches between. But in the era of Pangea, the waters were pushed aside, gathered into one vast ocean encircling the land like a dark, endless moat. The continents had not yet taken their wandering paths. They breathe together, a single organism of stone. It is humbling to imagine, a planet both familiar and strange, like seeing a loved one in an old photograph, unrecognizable yet undeniably them. The mountains of today were only whispers then. The rivers we know had not yet carved their way through valleys. The creatures that roamed were ancestors, early sketches, many of them lost to time. Yet, the soil beneath their feet was the same earth, the same rock, the same heartbeat that continues beneath us now. There is a quiet poetry in this unity. One land, one sea. Perhaps it was lonelier, this world without scattered continents, or perhaps it was more intimate, a closeness we can no longer quite grasp. Imagine standing on the western edge of Pangea, looking out at a horizon where the sun sinks into Panthalassa, the world ocean. There would be no Americas hidden across the waves, no distant Europe awaiting discovery, only water, infinite, eternal, unbroken. And perhaps you turn the idea over again, letting it glimmer differently in the soft light of thought. What if Pangea had stayed? Would our ancestors have still walked their migrations? Would languages have multiplied? Or would one tongue have echoed across the land? Would stories have diverged? Or would they have braided into a single epic, passed hand to hand, generation to generation? There is no answer, and in the quiet of no answer, the imagination drifts further. It is here, in these moments of wondering, that the journey truly begins. Not with facts or timelines, but with the feeling of distance, of how far back we must travel to glimpse even the outline of that ancient Earth. And already, the question changes shape. No longer simply, what was Earth like during Pangea? But also, how do we know at all? The continents, as they drifted apart, left traces behind, scars in the crust, fossils carried across oceans, mountains that match like torn fabric stitched back together. Before we can describe what Pangea felt like, we must first understand how we came to believe it ever existed. And so, the wondering leads us onward. For tonight, we will drift deeper into this story, as if leafing through the diary of the Earth, pages pressed with fossils instead of ink. The continents will reveal their secrets in quiet whispers, and we will listen, slowly, patiently, as though time itself were reading aloud. But first, before the record is opened, hold the question once more in your hand, like a stone warmed by the sun. What was Earth like during Pangea? And what if it had never let go of itself? Carry that question gently, for it will be our companion through the long night ahead. And in the stillness of that wondering, we find the path to the next thought. Not just what, but how. How do we know? How do we piece together a world that no eye has ever seen? That is where the story turns, where the next page waits to be unfolded. Time can feel like a horizon, distant, unreachable, always receding as we walk toward it. But in truth, time is not a line stretching endlessly ahead. It is more like a map, layered and folded, where each crease carries the memory of an age, and each mark reveals where the world once was. To wander into the story of Pangea, we must first learn how to read this map, how to step carefully through the library of deep time. Imagine Earth as a restless storyteller, always revising its own tale. The planet turns the pages with slow, deliberate movements, and every chapter is written in stone. Mountains are not simply heaps of rock. They are raised words, sentences pressed upward when continents collide. Valleys and plains are the quiet spaces between paragraphs, places where the story rests. The oceans, meanwhile, are the long silences, the pauses where the narrative gathers breath. In this library, each book is heavy and endless, its ink drawn from magma, its bindings held together by pressure and gravity. Time is shelved not in years, but in eras, epochs, and ages. To us, 1,000 years feels vast, but to the Earth, it is only a brief margin note in the corner of a much larger manuscript. When we speak of Pangea, we are turning back not a few pages but whole volumes, searching for a chapter written hundreds of millions of years ago. And the script of that chapter is not preserved in words, but in movements, for Earth does not sit still. Beneath the surface, we walk upon lies a restless sea, not of water, but of molten rock, flowing, shifting, sighing like a tide that never ends. Upon this hidden ocean rest the continents, enormous rafts of stone floating, drifting, colliding, separating. Plate tectonics, the scholars call it, but perhaps it is better seen as a kind of dance, an ancient, slow-motion ballet where the dancers are continents themselves. Think of Africa and South America. Their coastlines like puzzle pieces that once fit together. They were not always strangers across the Atlantic. They were once pressed side by side, their bones aligned. It was as if Earth had folded a sheet of fabric, then later tugged it apart, leaving the edges frayed but still recognizable. The drifting plates carried them away, and in that drifting, oceans were born. The mountains we see today are themselves the wrinkles in that fabric. When continents press into one another, the surface folds and rises, creating ranges like the Himalayas. They are reminders that Earth is always tailoring its own garment, always stitching and unstitching the cloth of land. Every fold, every seam, every tear marks another revision in the ongoing draft of the planet's story. If you listen closely, you can almost hear it. The low groaning of the crust, the creak of stone as it shifts, the deep heartbeat of magma rising and falling. It is not a quiet world beneath our feet, but a restless one, endlessly rewriting itself. And all the landscapes we know, our cities, our fields, our forests, are temporary annotations, penciled lightly on a manuscript that is still being written. To hold this perspective is to feel both small and connected. Small, because our lives are but flickers against the backdrop of such immense change. Connected, because every mountain, every shoreline, every plain is part of the same continuous story, one we are still living within. Pangea was one chapter. Today's divided continents are another. Tomorrow's pages are yet to be turned. And what of time itself? How do we mark it when the Earth's scale is so far beyond ours? We can think of it as a vast library corridor, shelves reaching higher than sight, filled with tomes too heavy to lift. Each book contains millions of years, and when opened, the pages glow with memories of climates, of creatures, of shifting lands. Some volumes are intact, others are burned or missing, torn out by erosion and loss. Yet enough remain that we can walk the aisle, fingertip brushing the spines, gathering glimpses of the grand story. Deep time humbles us. It reminds us that what we call the past is not merely human memory, but a geologic inheritance written in stone. Fossils are footnotes, telling us who walked here long before us. Strata are margins, layering one atop another, preserving sediments as though Earth were tucking away its own correspondence. Even the air carries fragments of history, tiny traces of ancient atmospheres sealed within ice, waiting for us to read them like bottled letters sent across time. The continents, then, are not fixed nations of stone. They are travelers, voyagers on a molten sea, pulled by currents too slow for the eye but unstoppable nonetheless. Over millions of years they converge and part, sometimes meeting as strangers, sometimes as old companions reuniting. Their journeys shape the very conditions of life. Climates shifting, species migrating, ecosystems blossoming and fading. And in one particular age, their paths aligned in such a way that all were gathered as one. Pangea. When we imagine this supercontinent, we are not conjuring a static picture, but a moment in a much longer motion. It was not that the land suddenly became one. It was that, over immense spans of time, drifting pieces slowly locked into place, drawn together by the planet's quiet insistence. Pangea was the pause in a sentence, the breath between phrases, before the continents once more drifted apart to form the scattered Earth we know. Let the image rest in your mind. A single land, surrounded by a single sea. Time as a map, and Pangea as one of its landmarks. To walk across that map is to walk through deep history, following the ink of tectonic drift, tracing the folds of mountains like fingers across braille. The land remembers, even when we forget. And now, with the primer laid before us, we can begin the next step of the journey. We have spoken of drifting plates and folded mountains, of Earth as storyteller and time as library. The foundations are set. The shelves of the library stand ready. The restless fabric of the Earth is spread before us. Let us now open the book to the age of Pangea. To imagine the birth of Pangea is to imagine patience itself, not the patience of a single life, or even of 1,000 generations, but of the Earth as it measures its moments, not in years, but in millions. It is a patience that wears mountains down into sand, and then, just as quietly, raises new mountains in their place. If you can picture such vast slowness, you can begin to see how a supercontinent is formed. Long before Pangea was whole, the world was a scattered archipelago of drifting lands. Continents wandered the globe like rafts on a molten sea, drawn forward by currents too deep to see. They moved at the pace of fingernails growing, imperceptible in the span of a human life, yet unstoppable across the ages. One landmass approached another, and though it would take tens of millions of years, the collision was as certain as sunrise. It was an ancient dance across molten seas. Each continent, vast beyond imagination, traced a slow arc across the surface of the planet. Africa turned its face toward North America. South America drifted upward, carrying with it forests and rivers that would one day vanish. Europe and Asia inched closer together, their edges folding like fabric drawn taut. The oceans between them, once wide and open, shrank bit by bit, as if the waters themselves were retreating in anticipation of the union to come. Imagine standing at the edge of that shrinking ocean, though no human could. With every 1,000 years, the horizon would shift, islands swelling into larger masses, coastlines creeping toward one another. To our eyes, it might seem as though nothing had changed. But to the eye of Earth, each century was another step in a grand procession, each tide another brushstroke on the canvas of creation. And so the continents converged. They did not crash with violence in the way two rocks might. Instead, they pressed and folded, grinding slowly, edges crumpling into ranges of mountains. The Appalachians, ancient and weathered now, were once among the mighty newborns of this collision, raised when what would become North America pressed against Africa. The seams of Pangea were written in stone, entire ranges born out of the pressure of continents embracing. To the Earth, this was inevitability. The plates are always in motion, and motion seeks its balance. Every scattered landmass, every drifting island, every fragment of crust is part of a larger geometry. Lines drawn in the molten deep. In that geometry, there was a point where all paths converged. A place where continents gathered like pieces of a puzzle, each one sliding into the shape it had always been meant to occupy. Pangea was not just land collected. It was the Earth gathering its own scattered thoughts into one long sentence. For a time, the world had only one face of land, one continent encircled by the endless sweep of ocean. The waters that remained became a single sea, vast and deep, wrapping around the unified landmass like a dark blue ring. Where once there had been many shores, now there was only one shoreline, stretching unbroken for tens of thousands of miles. This unity changed everything. The currents of the oceans shifted, redirected by the absence of scattered continents. Winds that once meandered between separate lands now roared across a single, uninterrupted surface. The climate itself bent to the new shape of the Earth, and storms began to form on a scale never seen before. Dry interiors stretched further from the sea than ever, baking beneath unbroken skies. Coastal edges endured hurricanes of unimaginable reach. With unity came power, and with power came transformation. Perhaps it is comforting to think of this as destiny. The scattered pieces of the world always meant to find each other, to rest side by side in one great expanse of stone and soil. Or perhaps it was only accident, the blind wandering of plates that happened, for a time, to align. Either way, the result was the same. Earth had drawn its continents together, and in doing so, it created the most dramatic stage it had ever set for life. Close your eyes and let the image form. A single landmass, stretching so wide that its interior never saw the sea. Forests rising where rains gathered, deserts yawning where clouds could not reach. Rivers threading their way toward coasts that seemed endlessly distant. Mountains like scars at the seams of union, reminders of the long embrace that birthed them. All around, a global ocean rolling in deep swells, circling this singular continent like a slow tide around an island of impossible size. It is said that when the Earth gathers itself, it also prepares for change. With Pangea's birth came a new world, one of extreme climates, powerful storms, and evolutionary experiments. For though the land was united, the life upon it would be tested in ways never before encountered. The supercontinent was not only a landscape, it was a crucible. And so we stand at the threshold of its story, watching as the last seas close and the last fragments of drifting land are drawn into place. The union is complete. The dance has reached its pause. The Earth, for this chapter, wears only one face, but unity is never stillness. With this gathering came forces that would reshape climate, weather, and life itself. The birth of Pangea was not just a merging of lands. It was the beginning of storms and trials the planet had never seen before, and that is where we drift next, into the tempests that arose when the world became one. There is a moment, in every great change, when the world holds its breath. A pause before the music begins, a silence that stretches long enough to be mistaken for permanence. In the story of Pangea, such a silence unfolded. The continents had gathered, their union complete, and for a time the planet seemed to linger in stillness, vast, dry, and waiting. To imagine this silence is to imagine vastness. Stand, if only in thought, at the edge of that singular land. Before you lies an expanse so wide that the horizon is no longer a promise of ocean, but of more land, and then more beyond that. The seas are fewer now, pressed outward into a single global ring, leaving the heart of the continent far removed from any shore. The air above these interiors was still, heavy, with clouds reluctant to wander so far from the waters that birthed them. Here, the Earth was a land of extremes. Close to the coasts, rains could still fall, forests could still grow, and rivers carved their way patiently to the ocean. But deeper within, as miles stretched into hundreds, the land dried into silence. Deserts expanded like open palms, vast basins of stone and dust, where the wind whispered but no relief came. The farther one walked inland, the more the ocean became a memory, and the more the sun became a relentless presence. The silence was not the silence of emptiness. Life was there, clinging, adapting, preparing. But compared to the lush scattering of continents that had once offered many shores and climates, Pangea's early unity was subdued, a threshold not yet crossed. Plants rooted where they could, spreading cautiously across the interior, their growth slowed by the scarcity of water. Small creatures scurried in the shade of rocks, their survival tied to patience and endurance. Larger animals moved along the rivers and coastlines, seldom daring to venture into the interior deserts that stretched like oceans of sand across the land. There is a strange stillness in such immensity. Imagine standing at night beneath skies unbroken by city lights, seeing stars cast in multitudes across the heavens. Imagine hearing nothing but the sweep of dry wind, no crash of waves, no hum of insects, only the quiet pulse of the earth itself. This was the great silence, the calm between the union of land and the storms that would later arise, a lull in which the world seemed to prepare itself for what was to come. And yet, within that silence, there was also a sense of inevitability. The planet does not linger forever in pause. Heat builds, currents shift, winds gather strength. The supercontinent may have seemed quiet, but beneath its surface, the molten sea continued its slow churn, restless as always. Even in silence, the Earth was never truly still. The coastlines, though distant, were immense in their own right. They stretched for tens of thousands of miles, unbroken and continuous, tracing the outline of the single land. Standing at one of these edges, one might have seen endless waves rolling in from the global ocean, their rhythm unceasing. But walk 100, 200, or 1,000 miles inland, and the sea was gone, replaced by the sun-bleached solitude of deserts. Such was the paradox of Pangea, unity of land, but division of climate, where the extremes of wet and dry were sharper than ever before. This was a threshold world, suspended between what it had been and what it would become. In the past, scattered continents had offered diversity, isolated ecosystems, sheltered seas, shifting climates. In the future, storms of unmatched scale would rage, testing every form of life upon the supercontinent. But in this silence, life lingered in preparation. It was as though the earth had gathered its breath, waiting to exhale. The deserts themselves told the story. Wind sculpted dunes into waves of sand that moved like frozen oceans across the continent. Rocks, once part of mountain chains, eroded into fragments, their surfaces smoothed by time. In these arid expanses, the silence was profound. No rustle of leaves, no call of birds, only the faint hiss of sand shifting beneath an indifferent sky. Yet even here, traces of endurance emerged. Hardy plants with deep roots, creatures that burrowed to escape the sun, species experimenting with survival in conditions harsher than before. At the edges of rivers, life thrived more freely. Reptiles basked on rocks warmed by the day's heat, their scales shining like polished stone. Amphibians lingered near shallows, still tethered to the water that had long been their refuge. Plants spread along the riverbanks, sending green fingers outward as though testing whether they might one day grasp the deserts themselves. Evolution does not rest, even in silence. And so the world of early Pangea was marked by waiting for storms, waiting for change, waiting for the balance between land and life to be rewritten. The supercontinent's vast interior held the potential for both desolation and growth. Its coastlines invited waves and winds into new patterns. Its mountains, raised by collision, stood like ancient witnesses, watching the silence unfold, knowing that their presence marked the beginning of new climates, new struggles, new forms of resilience. Silence can be deceiving. It can feel eternal, yet within it are the seeds of transformation. The great silence before Pangea's storms was no different. It was a pause in which the earth gathered itself, drawing strength for the upheavals that would follow. It was the stillness before thunder, the lull before the first gust of wind. Perhaps that is why this moment in the planet's history feels so mysterious. It was not yet the flourishing world of diverse ecosystems, nor yet the tempestuous stage of massive climate swings. It was a threshold, a land of one Earth, waiting for the next chapter to unfold. And so, with this silence in our minds, we can begin to walk across Pangea itself. Let us step gently into that singular land, where deserts yawn wide and coastlines stretch unbroken, where the silence of unity lies heavy upon the air. Now, let us walk across the land of one Earth. Now, let us drift further into the heart of this singular world, where land stretched farther than any horizon we know today. Imagine stepping onto a plain so wide, so unbroken, that no matter how long you walked, the line of earth and sky would always retreat ahead of you. This was the desert of Pangea, a vast interior so immense it dwarfed even the greatest deserts of our time. Where today we know the Sahara or the Gobi, then there was something far larger, far more silent, as though the earth herself had drawn a long breath and chosen not to exhale. Here, the air would have been dry, carrying with it fine grains of dust that traveled for weeks before settling. Winds, ancient and ceaseless, carved their signatures into stone, shaping arches, pillars, and ridges in slow, patient artistry. Nothing hurried. Time itself seemed to stretch thin over this expanse, each moment unhurried, each shadow cast by the sun stretching far across the flat earth. To stand in such a place, if one could, might awaken a strange humility, a sense of being not only small but almost transparent against the enormity of space. Above, the sky must have been immense, a dome of clarity, a canvas where the sun burned fiercely by day, and the stars revealed themselves unshielded by moisture or forest haze by night. Perhaps, under that sky, the constellations felt closer, sharper, as if the cosmos itself bent a little lower to whisper secrets to this boundless land. With so little standing in the way, no seas to soften the air, no forests to capture the winds, the desert interior of Pangea would have been a stage for light and silence. If you closed your eyes here, you might hear very little at all. No waves, no dense rustle of trees, no chorus of insects in countless numbers. Perhaps only the slow shifting of sand against sand, or the low moan of air pressed through rocky canyons. The Earth's voice in this place would have been pared down to its simplest tones, as though rehearsing the language of solitude. And yet in this silence, there was power. For life was not absent, only rare, only patient, hidden in pockets where water lingered. Think of oases scattered like secret notes across this immensity. In small hollows where ancient rivers once carved their paths, water might have gathered in shallow pools. There, ferns and early conifers clung to life, their roots winding deep into cracked stone. Primitive reptiles, cautious and enduring, may have rested in the shade of rocks, conserving their strength beneath the punishing sun. If you wandered long enough, you might come across footprints pressed into drying mud, signs of creatures that passed silently in the night, leaving only whispers of their presence. The wind carried stories too. Across tens of millions of years, grains of sand shifted from one end of the continent to the other, building dunes that rose like mountains, only to collapse and drift again. Imagine a dune taller than a cathedral, cresting, breaking, and beginning anew, each shift a reminder that even in stillness, the world is never truly still. The desert of Pangea was not empty, though it seemed so at first glance. It was alive in its own way, alive in patterns too slow and vast for one moment to capture. Perhaps, if you stood here, you would feel very small, not merely in body, but in time. The stones beneath your feet had been laid down long before you. Grains pressed and released, layers building, eroding, rebuilding again. They were not keeping time by minutes or hours, but by ages. In this desert, one could feel the presence of deep time more intimately than almost anywhere else. It was a library written in sand, but a library without shelves, its volumes always reshaped by the winds, its pages unreadable but undeniable. And there was heat, a relentless, inescapable heat. With no seas to temper the air, with no vast forests to cool the wind, the sun burned straight into the heart of the land. Days would stretch into blazing expanses of light, where the ground itself shimmered, and nights would fall cold and sharp, as if reminding the land that extremes were its natural state. To live here required resilience, a willingness to bend without breaking, to endure what could not be changed. Life that survived in Pangea's deserts carried that lesson forward into every age that followed. Yet silence does not mean absence. In places where stone gave way to basin, where rains fell in rare but heavy storms, the desert could suddenly awaken. Imagine a plain dry and lifeless for years. Then, in a single season, carpets of green bursting through the sand, flowers spreading in fragile abundance, insects humming briefly before vanishing once more. It might have been that such moments were fleeting gifts, glimpses of abundance set against an otherwise endless horizon of austerity. And perhaps this is what the desert of Pangea truly embodied: contrast. Immensity beside intimacy, silence beside sudden chorus, lifelessness beside hidden persistence. It was a world pared back to essentials, where every presence was marked by its rarity, where every pool of water was a sanctuary, where every shadow was a refuge. The desert was a reminder that even in a world unified, even in a supercontinent, there could be vast regions untouched by ease, demanding reverence from all who dared to pass through. As you picture it, let the desert stretch not only across space, but across your own thoughts. A place that invites wandering but also stillness. A place that asks nothing more than to be noticed, though it has existed longer than your notice could ever last. It is here, in the endless horizons of Pangea's heart, that we feel both the fragility and the endurance of life, both the brevity of a moment and the enormity of an age. Soon, the land will shift again in our journey. For while deserts defined much of Pangea's vast interior, the world of one continent was not only dry. There were rivers that cut across it, forests that held their ground, and coasts where waves pressed endlessly against a single unified edge. And so, we turn toward those places where water and life left their signatures on this ancient earth. From the stillness of the deserts, let us now lift our gaze toward the places where the land did not flatten, but rose, where the collisions of continents folded stone upon stone and created ridges that cut across the horizon. For Pangea was not only vast plains and endless sands, it was also a world of upheaval, a world where the earth revealed its restless strength by pressing whole land masses together, leaving behind mountains that stood as monuments to their union. The mountains of Pangea were born not from fire alone, but from embrace. An embrace so slow, so inexorable, that stone itself yielded, bending and buckling as if Earth's crust were a fabric drawn tight. Picture continents drifting across molten seas, carried like rafts until their edges struck one another. The force of that meeting did not end in fracture, but in rising. Rock was folded upward, layer upon ancient layer, until peaks broke the line of the sky. These were the seams of the supercontinent, stitched together with stone, scars written on the skin of the earth. Among them were ranges that today we know in softened form, their youthful sharpness long eroded away. The Appalachians, stretching across what is now North America, were once not gentle hills, but colossal heights, rivaling the Himalayas of our present world. They rose when ancestral North America pressed against what would become Africa, the collision thrusting up mountains so vast they cast shadows across whole regions. Imagine their slopes covered in green forests, their summits crowned with snow, storms rolling endlessly over their ridges, thunder echoing through valleys that seemed bottomless in scale. Far to the east, another scar told its story. The Urals, which now mark the line between Europe and Asia, were born in the same era, a spine of stone created by the clash of land masses converging. Even now, though time has worn them down, they remain as a reminder of that ancient union. A reminder that continents do not glide without consequence. Their summits, though gentler today, whisper of an age when they were sharp, proud, and new, rising like fresh stitches on the fabric of the earth. Mountains, in their essence, are wrinkles of time. They are not only stone, but memory, preserved in folded layers that once lay flat beneath ancient seas. Each ridge, each cliff face, holds the imprint of forces too vast to see in a lifetime, yet undeniable when we look back across ages. They tell us that Earth is never finished, never truly still, but always in conversation with itself, folding and unfolding like a book of stone that has no final page. To walk among these mountains in Pangea's age would have been to feel the pulse of the planet directly. Rivers, fed by snowmelt from high peaks, would have carved deep valleys, carrying minerals and soil outward into the lowlands. Forests would have crept up their sides, clinging to whatever crevices could hold life. Perhaps strange reptiles basked on sunlit cliffs, or early amphibians lingered in the damp, shadowed pools of mountain streams. Life here would have been both challenged and sheltered, finding refuge in the diversity of landscapes these ranges created. But mountains are not only homes, they are also barriers. To creatures wandering across the unified landmass of Pangea, the Great Ranges were obstacles, walls of stone dividing climates, separating deserts from forests, creating rain on one side and dryness on the other. Imagine standing in a valley while clouds gathered above, torn apart by peaks that forced the sky to split. Storms must have rolled across these ridges with a force magnified by their sheer scale, lightning illuminating whole valleys at once, rain cutting paths into the slopes, thunder reverberating like the heartbeat of the earth itself. And yet, even as they towered, these mountains carried within them the knowledge that time would wear them down. For no height lasts forever. Wind, rain, frost, and sun are patient sculptors, and they never cease their work. The Appalachians and the Urals today are softened remnants, their peaks smoothed, their edges blurred, their sharpness taken by millions of years of erosion. What once rivaled the Himalayas is now a quiet rise in the land, still majestic, but carrying more memory than menace. They remind us that even the greatest monuments of stone are not immune to time's slow touch. Perhaps then, the mountains of Pangea can be seen as symbols of both strength and humility. They were born of collision, of unyielding movement, of the irresistible push of land against land. Yet their fate, like all mountains, was to be worn down, to return to the sea as grains of sand, to begin the cycle anew. They are wrinkles in the skin of the earth, but also stitches, a reminder that the supercontinent was not seamless, but bound together by scars. And scars, as we know, are not merely marks of wounding, they are also signs of healing, signs that something has joined and endured. If you picture them now, let your mind wander between two images. The towering ranges of their youth, sharp and snow-capped, storms gathering along their spines, and the softened remnants we know today, gentle, forested, inviting. Between those images lies the span of hundreds of millions of years, a span that dwarfs every human measure of time. The Appalachians you might hike today are ghosts of their Pangean ancestors, still whispering of that ancient union, still carrying the echo of storms that once shook their heights. And perhaps this is their gift to us, not only their presence in the landscape, but their reminder that all things rise and fall, that what towers now will one day lie low, and that even in change, continuity remains. The mountains of Pangea may have softened, but their story continues, written into every stone, every ridge, every valley carved by time. Soon, we will leave these peaks behind and wander further, for the land of Pangea was not defined by height alone. Beyond the ranges lay rivers that wound across the continent, and coastlines where waves whispered against the edges of one united earth. And so, our journey drifts onward, toward waters that shaped life and carried stories across this ancient world. From the high ridges and folded peaks, water inevitably found its way downward. For mountains are not only monuments of stone, but fountains of motion, sending streams and torrents into the lowlands. Across the expanse of Pangea, those countless drops gathered into rivers that were unlike any we know today. They were not modest ribbons winding through small regions, but veins stretching across the heart of a continent so vast it seemed endless. Arteries feeding life into valleys that might have stretched for thousands of kilometers without ever touching an ocean. Imagine, if you will, a river beginning in the snow melt of a towering Pangean range, its waters quick and cold at first, tumbling over rocks and cutting narrow canyons. Over time, as tributaries joined, it swelled into a current broad enough to carry whole forests of driftwood. Perhaps it wound for months of walking, carving fertile valleys through arid interiors, sustaining pockets of green in landscapes that otherwise held only silence and sand. The rivers of Pangea were not merely pathways of water. They were threads of survival, weaving together scattered worlds of life within the immensity of the supercontinent. In these valleys, forests unlike any we see now may have thrived. Giant ferns, towering club mosses, and early conifers spread along the banks, their roots drinking deeply of soil enriched by silt carried from far upstream. Strange amphibians lingered in shaded shallows, and reptilian forms padded down to drink from the edges. Perhaps insects with wingspans wider than your outstretched arms hovered above reeds, filling the heavy air with a low drone. Life gathered here because water gathered here. And where rivers wandered, so too did the possibility of flourishing. To think of these waterways is to imagine not simply streams of water, but lifelines. The rivers of Pangea were the arteries of the supercontinent, pulsing with currents that carried nutrients, seeds, and stories across unimaginable distances. They linked mountains to deserts, forests to plains, and coasts to interiors. Their meandering paths carved memory into the land, leaving behind floodplains, deltas, and sedimentary archives that geologists now unearth as fragments of that vanished time. Each ripple, each flood, was a heartbeat of the earth itself, circulating vitality through its single, massive body. If one were to walk along such a river, the journey would be long enough to span climates and horizons. In the upper reaches, the air might be cool and thin, the river still young and hurried, dancing over stones. As days and weeks passed, the current would widen and slow, its surface reflecting skies so vast they appeared endless. Valleys would open, forests would crowd its banks, and life would follow its course faithfully, as if tethered to its generosity. By the time the river neared the sea, perhaps after thousands of kilometers, it would carry with it the memory of every landscape it had touched, a living archive of the continent. And yet, for all their scale, these rivers were also vulnerable to change. When climates shifted, when mountains rose or fell, when the supercontinent cracked with drought or storm, the rivers responded, bending, drying, swelling, vanishing. Perhaps some left behind only empty channels, scars of water long gone. Others may have migrated, carving new paths, reminding us that rivers are both eternal and fleeting. Eternal in their function, fleeting in their form. Even now, fragments of ancient riverbeds are preserved in stone, silent reminders that the land once pulsed with greater flows than we can easily imagine. Think of the metaphor they offer. If Pangea itself was a body, then the mountains were its bones, the deserts its vast skin, and the rivers its arteries. Through them coursed the currents of life, feeding, connecting, sustaining. They reveal to us that continents are not merely static slabs of stone, but living systems, shaped and animated by the flow of water. Each bend, each oxbow, each fertile floodplain is part of the quiet choreography of survival. The sound of those rivers must have been constant and reassuring in a world that could otherwise feel empty in its scale. To stand beside such a current, you might have heard the murmur of water against stone, the rustle of reeds, the calls of creatures hidden in forest shade. In such moments, the supercontinent would not have felt desolate at all, but alive, stitched together by a song of flowing water that refused to fall silent. Perhaps, too, these rivers carried more than water. They might have been the first great highways of life, allowing species to spread, carried along banks that linked habitats across unimaginable distances. Seeds drifting in currents could root far from their origins. Animals following the water could migrate, shaping patterns that endured for millions of years. In this way, rivers were not only arteries but also stories, pathways that wrote new possibilities into the fabric of Earth's unfolding tale. And yet, even with their scale, the rivers of Pangea must have ended as all rivers do, in surrender to the sea. Their fresh waters, after wandering across deserts and valleys, would eventually merge with salt tides, dissolving into something greater. It is a humbling truth that even the mightiest rivers find their home in oceans, just as even the greatest mountains are worn down to sand. Perhaps this too is part of their lesson, that all journeys, no matter how vast, led back to unity. If you close your eyes, you might picture one such river, beginning high in snowy peaks, cutting canyons, widening into plains, sustaining forests, carrying driftwood, nourishing valleys, and finally joining a coastline where waves receive it with endless patience. A journey of thousands of kilometers condensed into a single continuous flow, steady and tireless. The rivers of Pangea, though long vanished, remain as an image of movement, connection, and surrender. A reminder that even in the most immense landscapes, it is the quiet persistence of water that gives life. And now, as the rivers guide us outward, we approach the edge of the land itself. For Pangea, though immense, was still bounded by coastlines, And along those shifting margins, another voice was always waiting. The sea, restless and eternal, pressed against the edges of the supercontinent, shaping shores where waves whispered of both separation and unity. And so, our journey turns toward those waiting waters, to listen to the ancient song of the sea. And so, the rivers, after their long wandering across deserts, forests, and valleys, met the patient edge of the sea. Here, where fresh water gave itself to salt, the shape of Pangea revealed itself most clearly. For though the supercontinent was vast and seemingly endless, it was ringed by coastlines of astonishing length, a ribbon of sand and stone unrolling without pause, touching nearly every climate the world could offer. To drift along those shores in the mind is to walk upon the very seam between unity and separation, where land met water in a dialogue older than memory. Imagine beaches stretching farther than the horizon, not in the short fragments we know today, but as continuous lines curving along the body of one great landmass. There were no scattered continents to break the edges, no jagged interruptions of ocean between them. Instead, the supercontinent was outlined in an unbroken embrace of coast, its shorelines bending into vast bays, curling into peninsulas, opening into shallow inland seas that reached like fingers into the heart of the land. If one were to stand upon such a coast, the feeling might have been dizzying, the sense that the sea was infinite and the land unyielding, locked together in a strange equilibrium. The tides came and went as they always have, but their rhythm was magnified by the scale of the shores. In shallow bays, waters surged inward and outward, leaving wide tidal flats shimmering beneath the sky. Perhaps the mud glistened with rippling patterns, etched daily by the moon's pull, each wavelet leaving its inscription like a signature across wet earth. Here, strange creatures might have lingered, early reptiles padding across sand, leaving footprints that hardened into fossils, fish stranded briefly in pools, flickering with desperate movement before the tide returned. Life was experimenting at these margins, testing the spaces between water and air, where neither element fully surrendered its claim. Shallow seas, warm and nutrient-rich, may have stretched over continental shelves, creating habitats filled with coral-like forms, mollusks, and swarms of small creatures. Perhaps trilobites, nearing the twilight of their age, still scuttled in the sediments, while other species rose to prominence, each filling niches carved by the changing line of the shore. These were transition zones, always in motion, always uncertain, where survival meant learning to endure cycles of abundance and withdrawal. And from such thresholds, great transformations often begin. To drift along these coastlines in imagination is to trace the border of possibility. Each bay, each estuary, was a cradle of life, a place where rivers delivered their gifts of sediment and nutrients, where the sea responded with its endless capacity for renewal. The beaches may have stretched for hundreds of kilometers, dunes rising and falling like silent waves of stone and sand, shaped by wind and tide. The sound here would have been timeless. The hiss of surf retreating, the crash of waves arriving, the calls of creatures half hidden in reeds or emerging from the shallows. Consider the perspective of a traveler in such a place. Walking along the shoreline, days might pass without encountering a mountain or forest, only the constant rhythm of ocean and land. At times, the sea would seem gentle, glassy, and still beneath pale skies. At others, it would reveal its power, battering cliffs, reshaping beaches, reminding all that permanence is an illusion. Perhaps the traveler would feel both awe and humility, sensing that the meeting of land and sea is less a boundary than a conversation, one that has never ceased, even across hundreds of millions of years. And what stories the coastlines could tell. If only they had voices. They have seen tides pull away, exposing wide flats where creatures scuttled. They have seen storms carve new inlets, swallowing parts of the land. They have seen the gradual rise and fall of sea levels, painting and repainting the edge of the continent. The shore is always rewriting itself, always erasing and inscribing anew. In that way, it is perhaps the most honest mirror of time. Never still, never complete. Always in the act of becoming. Even the creatures that lingered here carried the tension of two worlds. Amphibians still dependent on water must have crowded the brackish zones, while reptiles learned to stride farther inland, carrying with them the freedom of air. Some may have nested in sand, their eggs buried in safety above the tide's reach. Others swam in shallow lagoons, bodies shaped by currents and tides. Each adaptation was a negotiation with the shoreline, a bargain struck between the stability of land and the fluidity of sea. There is a quiet poetry in imagining these coastlines, for they remind us that borders are not endings, but beginnings. Where one realm seems to stop, another begins, and in their overlap lies the most fertile ground for transformation. The edges of Pangea, vast and unbroken, were laboratories of change, where the sea taught the land its patience, and the land taught the sea its limits. And yet, not every day upon these shores was gentle. For beyond the calm of shallow bays and endless beaches, the wider ocean stirred with moods that could not be ignored. Winds gathered across open waters, waves rose into towering walls, and storms marched inland, reshaping coasts with their fury. These tempests, born of climates still shifting and seas still restless, would remind every creature and every grain of sand that the dialogue between land and water is never peaceful for long. And so, as we walk the edge of Pangea in thought, feeling the tides against our imagination and the horizon stretch without end, we must turn our gaze outward toward the waters themselves. For beyond those waves, storms were gathering, and with them, a new voice of the supercontinent was preparing to speak. Close your eyes and imagine the sky above Pangea, not above your country, nor above your continent, but above one single enormous land. The winds did not know borders, the storms did not belong to nations. Instead, they danced across a world where the land stretched unbroken, and the sea circled it like a restless moat. At the heart of this supercontinent, far from any ocean breeze, the air grew still and dry. Rain could not easily reach these inland deserts, for the clouds had already emptied themselves at the edges, where moist air first struck the land. The center of Pangea was a realm of silence. Parched earth, shimmering horizons, skies so vast that even storms seemed like whispers from another world. It was here, in this immensity, that time itself felt heavy, as though the land were holding its breath. But at the edges, the edges, life was different. The coasts of Pangea faced an unbroken ocean, and from those endless waters, storms gathered strength. When the sun heated the sea, vast clouds rose, swelling with moisture. Then, carried by warm winds, they rolled across the continent's shores, releasing their burden in torrents. Mega monsoons drenched forests and lowlands. Rivers swelled, valleys flooded. The rhythm of water was the heartbeat of this world. Dry, then drowned, then dry again. The storms were not gentle summer rains. They were vast engines of wind and thunder, driven by the sheer scale of one earthbound landmass. Some rose from the equator, bringing warmth and heavy rains. Others descended from the poles, carrying biting cold. When they met, They clashed like titans, birthing tempests that roared across the coastlines. To live along Pangea's edges was to live with the certainty of change. Sunshine one moment, fury the next. Yet even this wildness carried beauty. Imagine standing on a shoreline, watching as towering clouds rise higher than mountains, their bellies glowing orange with the setting sun. The air is thick, heavy with the smell of salt and rain. And when the storm breaks, lightning flashes in streaks so wide they illuminate the world as though the day had returned for an instant. This was the theater of Pangea's skies, vast and unrestrained. The climate of one Earth was a story of extremes. In the deserts at its heart, creatures had to endure thirst and blazing suns. Near the coasts, they adapted to the floods and storms, learning to bend with the winds rather than break. Season after season, the land was sculpted not only by rivers and mountains, but by the restless moods of the sky. And always, there was rhythm, the steady pulse of wind flowing from ocean to land, of rain falling, rivers swelling, deserts waiting. Sometimes gentle, sometimes wild, always vast. The weather of Pangea was not simply a backdrop to life, it was the stage itself, shaping the world to come. For in this restless climate, life was tested. And in its testing, it grew stronger. Soon, the land of one Earth would witness creatures learning to rise, to walk, to breathe in new ways. But before that story begins, we linger here, in the winds and rains of long ago. The skies have given us their rhythm. The stage is set. Now let us step into the story of life itself. From the restless skies, we drift now down toward the land itself, into a realm where stone gave rise to green. The Earth of Pangea, though one continent, held many worlds within it. And among the most powerful of these were the forests. They were not like the forests we know today, though echoes remain in pines and firs, in the unfurling of ferns each spring. These were forests of a lost age, immense and unbroken, where the air hung thick with the scents of resin, spores, and damp soil. The trees reached upward with slow, patient gestures, their needles catching the wind, their roots sinking deep into ancient soils. Conifers stood tall and stoic, their branches layered like living stairways. Beneath them grew seed ferns, strange to our modern eyes, plants that were neither quite the ferns we see carpeting today's damp valleys, nor the flowering plants that would one day dominate the earth. They were something in between, pioneers of a form the future would perfect, their broad leaves drinking in the light that fell through the canopy. Around them, true ferns spread in wide feathered fans, creating a green floor that shifted with each gust of air. Walking here, or drifting in imagination as you now do, one might feel that the forest itself was alive in a way more ancient, more communal than what we sense today. The plants were not just scenery. They were engineers of the climate, makers of the very breath that filled the sky. They drank carbon from the air and released oxygen, changing the balance of atmosphere as steadily as tides shape a shore. In their shadows, the earth cooled. In their presence, clouds gathered. These forests were not passive. They were part of the pulse of Pangea itself. It might help to think of them as green oceans rooted to stone. Like seas, they rolled across the land in vast, unbroken stretches. Where rain fell often, their density was overwhelming. Mile after mile of trunks and fronds so thick one could wander for weeks and never glimpse open ground. Where water was scarcer, the forest thinned into open groves, but still the green found ways to endure. From above, had one looked across Pangea, these expanses would have resembled waves frozen mid-crest, rippling endlessly from horizon to horizon. Their silence, too, was a kind of oceanic hush. The sound was not of waves but of wind moving through countless branches. a low whisper that could rise to a roar when storms rolled inland. Every breath of wind was caught, bent, and released again, echoing through this ancient green labyrinth. To stand among them would have been to feel small, not because of danger, but because of the sheer continuity of life. Trees rooted for centuries, ferns unrolling generation after generation, spores drifting like invisible constellations. And here, in this strange balance, climate and forest were locked in a dialogue. The forests absorbed warmth and shaded the soil, making rain linger longer where it fell. In turn, the rains sustained the trees, thickening their growth. Perhaps the forests of Pangea were not only inhabitants of their age, but shapers of it. The weather of one Earth, those great monsoons and long droughts, was softened or sharpened depending on how the forests spread. They were like green lungs breathing in rhythm with the sky. To imagine such a forest is to step outside of time as we measure it. The trees here did not yet know the songs of birds, for birds had not yet come into being. Their branches were not filled with blossoms, for flowering plants had yet to evolve. Instead, their reproduction was quieter, more ancient, cones and spores, drifting on the wind or falling to the damp soil below. Life moved at a pace so slow it could scarcely be called movement, yet it reshaped the world all the same. Perhaps you picture yourself wandering through such a place. The air is warm, tinged with the sharp scent of pine resin and the earthy breath of ferns. Light filters down in thin shafts, golden at first, but quickly swallowed by the deep greens around you. The ground is soft, layered with centuries of fallen needles and fronds. You hear no bird call, no buzzing insect in the way we hear them today. Only the faint hum of wind in the branches above. Every now and then, the forest opens into a clearing where low ferns sway. And here, if you linger, you might see something stir at the edges of vision. An ancient reptile, a scuttling creature, a hint of life awaiting its moment. And yet, for now, the plants hold center stage. They are the quiet architects of this age, sculpting both land and sky. With every season, they drew down the carbon that filled the atmosphere, locking it into wood and root. With every decade, their fallen bodies layered into the soil, pressed deeper into the earth, where heat and pressure began the slow work of transformation. The coal and fossil fuels that one day humans would unearth and burn, those, too, were gifts of these ancient forests, stored sunlight from a time when the world was still gathering its pieces together. There is humility in remembering this. These green giants and delicate ferns shaped not only their own era, but ours as well. Their long patience allowed the world to cool, allowed oxygen to rise, allowed creatures to thrive in air richer and cleaner than before. They remind us that time does not always announce its work with thunder or flame. Sometimes it is the slow unfurling of leaves, the near-silent fall of a cone to the ground that remakes the world. And as we linger here, the imagination drifts further. If you are drowsing, that is no matter. The forest will wait for you. Its trees stand in silence, their roots deep, their crowns lifted toward an ancient sky. Whether you are awake or adrift in dreams, the story remains, unfolding at its patient pace. Soon, though, this quiet stage will stir, for within these forests, creatures were beginning to move, to climb, to breathe in the new air shaped by green. The stillness would not last forever, and so let us wander onward, deeper into this ancient woodland, until we find what stirred beneath its shadows. From the hush of the green canopy, the stillness begins to ripple, not with thunder or storm, but with movement so small it might be missed if you were not patient. Beneath the towering conifers, across the fern-lined floor, life stirred in forms both familiar and strange. These were the small wanderers of Pangea, creatures whose steps, wings, and breaths would echo down through the corridors of time. They were humble compared to the giants that would follow, yet in their quiet persistence, they laid the groundwork for ages to come. Amphibians were among the first to claim this shadowed stage. Emerging from pools left behind by the rains, they carried with them the memory of water in every breath. Their bodies were damp, their skins delicate, and their movements hesitant, as if each journey onto land was still a negotiation between past and future. In shallow streams, salamander-like forms glided with slow grace, their gills waving gently in the current. Some grew larger than any amphibian we know today, their wide mouths poised to snatch whatever drifted too close. To walk beside them would have been to glimpse the tenuous tether between water and land, a reminder that the story of life was still testing its boundaries. Alongside them, reptiles crept into view, smaller than the dinosaurs they would one day herald, but already hinting at the adaptability that would carry their kind across millions of years. They were lizard-like creatures, scaly bodies hugging the warmth of stone, eyes glinting with ancient patience. They moved cautiously, tongues flickering, their presence almost invisible against the dappled light of the forest floor. These were the pioneers of independence from water, no longer bound to moist skin or constant streams, but armored against dryness, capable of venturing farther into the heart of the continent. In their quiet resilience, they were whispering a promise. Life would not only survive on land, it would thrive. And above this low theater, wings glimmered. Dragonflies, enormous by our standards, ruled the air, some with wingspans as wide as a hawk's. Imagine them catching the light as they darted between shafts of sun, their transparent wings flashing like living stained glass. They fed on smaller insects, themselves newly diversifying, and their flight was both graceful and predatory. In the still air of a Pangean afternoon, the hum of their wings might have been the loudest sound, a reminder that even the smallest creatures could claim dominion over vast spaces. The insect world itself was undergoing quiet revolutions. Cockroaches, mayflies, beetles, forms we still recognize today, were already scuttling and fluttering, their bodies adapted to niches created by the forests. Some may have burrowed into the soil to avoid the heat of the interior deserts, while others clung to the lush valleys near rivers. Ants had not yet come into being, but termites and their kin were beginning to experiment with social living, tiny murmurs of the collective lives that would one day shape ecosystems. Each scurry, each wing beat, was part of the larger experiment of life upon this single landmass. Perhaps, if you stood in such a forest clearing, you would not first notice these wanderers. Your gaze might rise to the towering trunks, or stretch out toward the horizon, lost in the sheer scale of Pangea. But linger long enough, kneel close to the earth, and you would see that the true drama was being carried out in miniature. A reptile basking in sunlight, conserving its warmth for the cool night ahead. An amphibian slipping silently into the water, ripples expanding outward like soft echoes. A dragonfly hovering above, its compound eyes mapping a world both vast and immediate. These were quiet lives upon a vast stage, and in their smallness, there is something deeply humbling. We often imagine Earth's history as a tale of giants, towering dinosaurs, immense trees, catastrophic events. Yet, most of the story has been written by the small, the unnoticed, the creatures who lived and died without leaving monuments. Their remains seldom became fossils, their movements seldom recorded. Yet without them, the great arcs of history would never have been possible. The giants stood upon their shoulders, even if those shoulders were fragile wings or scaly feet, no bigger than your thumb. Speculation invites us further. Perhaps the stillness of the forests was broken by the chirr of early insects, or by the splash of an amphibian diving for cover. Perhaps in the heat of the day, lizards lay so still they seemed carved from stone, waiting for dusk to move again. These creatures did not know they were precursors, did not sense that they were paving paths for future empires of life. They simply lived, seeking food, avoiding danger, reproducing in the simple, relentless rhythm of survival. Their quietness was not insignificance, it was foundation. If you drift now in thought, you might imagine yourself shrinking to their scale, moving among them as one more wanderer. The forest would feel immense, every fern a towering canopy, every stone a mountain to climb. A dragonfly's shadow might seem like a predator's swoop, its buzzing wings filling the sky above. The soil itself would be a landscape of caverns and grains, alive with hidden motions. To live at that scale is to realize that the vastness of the supercontinent was mirrored by vastness in miniature, whole worlds contained in a square foot of moss and leaf. And so we see that Pangea was not only a land of endless deserts and mountains, but also a land of tiny footsteps, of delicate wings, of skins that glistened with the memory of water. The stage was grand, but it was filled with actors of every size, each shaping the story in ways both visible and hidden. The giants would come later, but without these first wanderers, the world could not have held them. For now, though, the story lingers in this quiet scale. The forests breathe, the rivers murmur, and the small wanderers move unseen among the shadows. It is here, in these hushed beginnings, that the pulse of future ages can be felt, faint but steady, like a heartbeat beneath the soil. Soon, other creatures will step forward, larger, bolder, reshaping the balance once more. But before they arrive, the earth belongs to these unassuming pioneers, who lived gently upon a land both vast and young. From the hush of the smaller wanderers, the story now swells into larger shapes, vast forms moving slowly across the land. Where once the quiet of amphibians and lizards defined the forest floor, now the silhouette of giants began to rise against the horizon. They were not yet the dinosaurs we often imagine, no towering brontosaurs or horned ceratopsians, but their ancestors, the archosaurs and other great creatures of this age, already hinting at the grandeur to come. Their presence transformed the landscape into a stage not just of whispers, but of slow, deliberate thunder. These early archosaurs walked with bodies both familiar and strange, some sprawling close to the ground, others already lifting higher on stronger legs. They bore in their frames the seeds of future empires, crocodiles, birds, and the mighty dinosaurs that would one day dominate. But here, in Pangea's early unity, they were still experimenting, still humble in their grandeur. Picture them moving across the open stretches, long tails balancing their steps, jaws lined with primitive teeth, eyes scanning a horizon that stretched farther than any we know today. They were learning how to be large, testing the possibilities of size in a world that had room enough for vastness. Alongside them moved lumbering herbivores, creatures that grazed across the fern prairies and conifer clearings. Their bodies were heavy, their movements slow, like living boulders shifting through time. Each mouthful of plant life was part of an endless rhythm, one bite after another, reshaping forests and grassless plains through steady consumption. The air might have trembled slightly as they walked, vibrations carrying through the soil. To see them was to see patience embodied. No rush, no frenzy, only the steady persistence of life made large. Perhaps the most striking contrast was not their movement, but the silence around them. In our imaginations, we might hear roars and cries, yet the soundscape of Pangea may have been quieter than we expect. No bird calls, for birds had not yet come. No mammals rustling in abundance, for their time was far away. Instead, the giants moved through hushed landscapes, accompanied only by the wind over deserts, the hum of insects, the occasional splash of an amphibian in a nearby stream. Their size was dramatic, but the atmosphere was subdued. A theater of enormity played out in near silence. The predators of this age were themselves precursors, smaller than the titanic carnivores of later eras, yet already testing the shapes of pursuit and power. Some resembled crocodiles that lifted higher on their legs, agile enough to chase prey across open land. Their teeth left marks in the bones of contemporaries, records of a struggle for survival written long before Tyrannosaurus or Allosaurus ever appeared. Perhaps you could imagine one waiting by a riverbank, half hidden, then lunging with sudden speed. Or another stalking slowly through the shadowed forest, its body blending into the mottled light, a whisper of danger in an otherwise quiet world. In these forms we see echoes of what was to come, but also of what had been. The archosaurs and their kin were both successors to the smaller reptiles and ancestors to the giants yet to arrive. They were bridges in the living story, transitional but vital. Their size gave them an authority in the landscape, but it was not dominance as we might imagine it. They shared the stage with countless smaller creatures, each life intertwined in the fragile experiment of survival. The giants were visible, impressive, unforgettable, yet still bound by the same needs as dragonflies or salamanders: to eat, to rest, to avoid danger, to leave behind the next generation. Speculation paints the scene more vividly. Imagine a herd of these early herbivores grazing across an endless Pangean plain, their shapes moving slowly against the backdrop of distant mountains. Dust rises at their feet, settling in the warm air, while overhead the vast sky stretches unbroken. A predator lingers at the edge of the group, cautious but determined, eyes glinting with the promise of a meal. The herd shifts, restless but steady, their bodies forming a living wall of mass and movement. No words, no strategies, only instinct, a dance older than memory itself. And always, the contrast between scale and silence lingers. The earth was immense, the creatures larger than much that had come before, yet the soundscape remained sparse. A listener might hear the crunch of vegetation between heavy jaws, the crack of branches beneath lumbering steps, the exhalation of air from cavernous lungs. These were the breaths and footsteps of a world learning how to be alive at scale, filling space without yet filling it with noise. Perhaps in that quiet, one might have felt the immensity of life more profoundly, each sound carrying farther, each movement magnified by stillness. You, drifting now, might imagine walking alongside them, not as a participant, but as a quiet observer. Their size would dwarf you, their shadows stretching long over the ground. Yet their pace would not frighten, for it was slow, deliberate, almost meditative. They were not rushing creatures. They lived in rhythm with the patience of geology itself, bodies molded by the vastness of time, footsteps sinking softly into soils that would one day turn to stone. Their very beings seemed to echo the calm persistence of the continent they roamed. And so the giants of the land remind us of a paradox. Immense in size, yet humble in sound. Monumental in form, yet fragile in fate. They were not yet the rulers of Earth, but they carried within them the patterns that would one day shape empires of life. Their presence was both a promise and a pause, a glimpse of the grandeur to come. Soon, other shapes would rise, more varied, more specialized, filling the supercontinent with greater diversity. But for this moment, in the quiet of Pangea, the giants moved steadily across the land, living monuments in a world still learning how to host them. From the hush of the plains where giants moved slowly, our attention drifts outward, toward the edges where land meets water. For Pangea was not only a world of deserts and forests, but also of seas, shallow and warm, where creatures stirred in ways both ancient and new. The shoreline was never just a boundary. It was a meeting place, a threshold where two realms touched. And from that mingling, life found endless ways to move. Here, the swimmers and the crawlers shaped their stories, half in the water, half upon the land, teaching us that boundaries are never as rigid as they seem. Along these coasts, shallow seas pooled like wide mirrors, reflecting skies heavy with storms. Within them, early marine reptiles drifted, testing the waters of dominance. Some bore sleek, fish-like bodies with long tails for propulsion, their limbs reshaped into paddles that carved through the currents. They were hunters, gliding after fish and smaller creatures, weaving their paths between shoals of darting prey. Their bodies were both alien and familiar, carrying echoes of the reptiles that walked the land, yet remade by water's touch into something fluid, something suited for drift and pursuit. On the beaches and estuaries, amphibious wanderers pulled their bodies across wet sand, half in retreat from the sea, half in return to it. Their skin glistened under the sun, breathing both through lungs and through the contact of damp air. They were creatures of in-between spaces, neither fully bound to the land nor entirely surrendered to the water. Their slow, dragging paths across the shoreline were lines of living calligraphy, marking the sand with evidence of a restless existence. One foot here, one fin there, never fully committed to either world. The shallow seas themselves were nurseries, immense and generous. In warm lagoons, the sun's energy fed plankton, which fed schools of fish, which in turn drew the gaze of predators circling silently through the water. The cycles of life unfolded gently, almost invisibly, yet each moment was a matter of survival. Tiny hatchlings emerged in countless numbers, only a few surviving long enough to grow. Larger forms prowled the shadows, their jaws snapping with sudden speed, their hunger driving the endless dance of pursuit. To look beneath the surface was to witness a silent storm of life, subtle, unending, and unseen from above. Imagine a shoreline at dusk, where the waves stretch endlessly, rolling in soft patterns upon the sand. A marine reptile surfaces briefly, its head breaking the waterline, eyes scanning the horizon before slipping back into the depths. Near the edge, amphibians crawl from the surf to rest in the warmth of the air, their bodies rising and falling with slow breaths. Insects hover above the tide pools, dipping low to taste the salt, while small creatures scurry in the intertidal zone, vanishing quickly with each retreating wave. The scene is quiet, almost dreamlike, yet every motion is part of a larger rhythm, each being a fragment of the ocean's unfolding story. The oceans of Pangea were not calm in every place. Storms swept across them, driving waves against the coastlines, stirring the shallow nurseries with sudden violence. Yet life adapted, as it always does. Some creatures found safety in deeper waters, where the turbulence was muted. Others sought shelter in reefs and rocky alcoves, their bodies pressed against the earth as the waves thundered overhead. And when the storm passed, the sea renewed itself, sunlight piercing through stirred sediments, plankton blooming again in the wake of destruction. This was the cycle: creation, disruption, renewal. Life carried on the shoulders of water. You, drifting now, might imagine yourself wading into one of these ancient seas. The water is warm, shallow enough that the ground still meets your feet, yet alive with countless hidden movements. Tiny fish flicker around your legs. Shadows pass swiftly beneath the surface, and in the distance, a larger shape glides with unhurried confidence. On the shore behind you, amphibians drag their bodies toward the damp earth, while overhead, insects skim across the air, their wings glistening in the light. Nothing here is still, and yet everything feels slow, measured, a rhythm that seems older than memory itself. Creatures drifted, crawled, swam, and vanished. This was their world, and though they may be gone now, their echoes remain, fossils pressed into stone, bones scattered across ancient seabeds, traces written in rocks that have folded and shifted with the ages. The seas were editors of memory, erasing much, preserving little, offering us glimpses but never the full story. Perhaps that is part of their mystery, that so much life once teemed in these waters, and yet so little of it survives in evidence, leaving us to dream the rest. The swimmers and crawlers remind us that existence is not about sharp divisions. Land and sea are not opposites but partners, exchanging life back and forth in an endless tide. In their journeys, we glimpse the fluidity of being, how forms can change, how worlds can blend. They were early whispers of resilience, adapting not by staying fixed, but by learning to move between realms. Their story is one of transition, not arrival, of dwelling in thresholds rather than destinations. And so, as the waves recede and the shoreline falls into evening stillness, we leave behind the amphibians and reptiles, the shallow seas and their hidden nurseries. For even as life thrived here, it was only one layer of Pangea's unfolding tale. Soon, the skies above would begin to stir with creatures who sought to claim the air itself. The shoreline quiets, the shallow seas retreat into memory, and the stage of Pangea begins to shift once again. For all the stillness we imagine in these ancient worlds, time was never still. Evolution moved patiently, a sculptor working with endless ages as clay, shaping life with each breath of wind, each drop of rain, each tremor in the earth. The world was not yet ready for the thunder of dinosaurs, but it was preparing, slowly, deliberately, for their arrival. This was the pre-dinosaur dawn, a time of anticipation woven into the very fabric of existence. Creatures of many forms walked, crawled, and swam across Pangea, none of them yet bearing the grandeur of the giants to come, yet each carrying within them the seeds of future dominion. Small reptiles scurried across the dry interiors, their bodies lean, efficient, and endlessly adaptable. Amphibians lingered still in rivers and swamps, though their age was fading, their dominance slipping as the air grew warmer, drier, less forgiving. Insects filled the skies in teeming numbers, some vast enough to rival birds in wingspan, but even their reign would shrink in the changing climates to come. The land itself seemed to be waiting, its climate shifting, its storms sharpening. Mega monsoons swept across the supercontinent, alternating between parched droughts and floods of abundance. These cycles demanded resilience, favoring those who could endure hunger, heat, and sudden change. Each storm, each season, was an unwritten test of survival. Slowly, across these trials, life began to favor new forms, creatures with stronger lungs, more efficient ways of conserving water, better tools for both pursuit and escape. Among them were the archosaurs, the ruling reptiles whose lineage would one day give rise to the dinosaurs. At first, they were unremarkable. Small, agile beings with elongated limbs and sharp teeth, moving swiftly across open plains or lurking along the edges of rivers. Yet in their design lay possibility. Their hips and legs suggested new ways of walking. Their bodies hinted at the endurance needed for a hotter, harsher world. They were experiments of evolution, sketches of a future masterpiece not yet revealed. Picture one such archosaur on a dusky plain of Pangea, its head tilts, nostrils catching a distant scent, while the red glow of a sinking sun casts long shadows across the cracked earth. Around it, smaller lizards dart between stones, insects hum in the heavy air, and somewhere nearby, the slow splash of an amphibian echoes from a shrinking pool. It moves with a confidence beyond its size, a preview of what will come. Upright posture, quick reflexes, a sharp awareness of its world. To see it is to glimpse not just a creature, but the direction in which life itself was leaning. Yet for all their promise, these archosaurs were not yet rulers. They shared the land with other lineages, competitors just as adapted to their niches. Strange mammal-like reptiles still wandered the plains, their bodies halfway between reptile and mammal, their teeth sharper, their jaws more precise. They hunted, grazed, and persisted, unaware that their dominance would fade in the coming ages. In their shadow, the ancestors of mammals quietly held on, small and fragile, yet destined for a distant triumph long after Pangea broke apart. This age was a prelude, a quiet rehearsal before the main act. The Earth itself was restless, tectonic forces rumbling beneath the crust, the supercontinent straining against its own unity. Volcanoes erupted in fiery outbursts, spilling ash and molten stone across wide swaths of land. Each eruption was a reminder of the instability beneath the surface, of the fractures that would one day tear Pangea into pieces. These upheavals reshaped climates, darkened skies, and pushed evolution forward with sudden, unforgiving trials. And still, life endured. It adapted. It prepared. Evolution's slow patience was never idle, but always sculpting, always experimenting. The world was arranging its cast for the age to come, setting the stage for giants that would dominate sky, land, and sea. Every small reptile, every scurrying insect, every lumbering archosaur was part of a quiet momentum, a building pressure toward transformation. For you, the dreamer walking these ancient landscapes, it is easy to be lulled by the calm, the vast horizons, the slow steps of wandering creatures, the patient flow of rivers and tides. But beneath that stillness, something was gathering. The patterns of life were bending toward a new order, one that would roar and thunder and leave imprints large enough to endure across the ages. The pre-dinosaur dawn was not about grandeur, but about preparation. It was a time of potential energy, stored in bone and blood, in climate and stone. The patience of evolution was immense, stretching across millions of years, but it was never idle. It was waiting, always waiting, for the moment when life would leap into new forms, filling the world with creatures so vast and powerful that even their extinction could not erase their memory. But time was never still. Pangea would not last forever. The land was already straining against its bonds, the climates already shifting, the creatures already changing. Soon, the stage would erupt into something greater, and the age of giants would begin. From the quiet anticipation of life preparing for change, the gaze now turns downward, into the earth itself. Beneath the forests, beneath the rivers, beneath even the bones of the mountains, there was another rhythm, slower than seasons, older than rivers, deeper than any storm. It was the slow heartbeat of the planet, pulsing in waves of molten stone, carrying with it the inevitability of change. For all its immensity, Pangea was never still. because the earth beneath it never was. Within the mantle, currents of heat rose and sank, as though the planet breathed with a fire we could not see. Hot rocks swelled upward in slow-motion fountains, spreading outward, pushing against the crust like invisible tides. Cooler rocks sank downward, returning in a cycle that never ceased. This was convection, the patient stirring of the Earth's interior, a movement so gradual that a lifetime would not perceive it, yet so relentless that no continent, however vast, could escape its pull. Imagine the ground beneath your feet, not as immovable stone, but as rafts drifting on a hidden sea. These rafts, the tectonic plates, floated on the softer rock of the asthenosphere, carried like ice on a slow, viscous current. They collided, they drifted apart, they ground against one another. And though the motion was measured in inches each year, across millions of years, it redrew the world. Mountains rose where plates crashed together. Oceans opened where they pulled apart. Continents themselves were sculpted by this unseen tide. Pangea, for all its immensity, was caught in this flow. It was not the final state of the Earth, but a passing arrangement in a dance that had been repeating for billions of years. Before Pangea, there had been others: Rodinia, Nuna, Columbia, each born of collision, each torn apart again by the same restlessness. The Earth, it seems, could never abide permanence. It gathered its fragments into one, only to scatter them once more, as though unity was always destined to dissolve. The metaphor is inescapable. A heartbeat, slow and steady, yet irresistible. With each pulse, the mantle shifted, and with each shift, the crust above it moved. Sometimes the pulse was gentle, a drift so slight it could not be noticed. Sometimes it was violent, expressed in earthquakes, in volcanic eruptions, in sudden ruptures that broke the silence of stone. But whether gentle or fierce, the heartbeat never faltered. It was the planet's deepest rhythm, the silent driver of continents, climates, and lives. If you stood upon Pangea, you would not have felt it. The ground beneath your feet would have seemed eternal, immovable. The rivers would still flow, the mountains would still stand, the winds would still carry their songs. But beneath all that silence, the plates were shifting, straining against one another, building tension that would take millions of years to resolve. It is a reminder that what feels stable may be only a pause in a deeper movement, a stillness that hides its own impermanence. In this hidden restlessness, there is philosophy. Nothing, however vast, is fixed. Not the mountains, not the seas, not even the very continents beneath us. The Earth gathers and divides, creates and unravels, always in motion, always becoming. To look at Pangea is to look at a moment in a cycle far beyond human scale, a fleeting arrangement of stone and soil across an ocean of time. And perhaps that is why we are drawn to it, this memory of a singular land. It speaks to a longing for unity, for the world gathered as one. But the Earth reminds us that unity is never final, never absolute. It is always temporary, always fragile, always subject to the deeper currents that move unseen. Even Pangea, the greatest landmass ever gathered, could not resist the heartbeat beneath stone. In time, rifts would form within it. Fissures would stretch across its plains, widening into valleys, then seas. The mantle's heat would well upward, tearing the land apart with patient force. What seemed eternal would dissolve, and from its breaking would come the continents we know today. The Earth was not cruel in this, only inevitable. Its restlessness was not destruction, but transformation, carrying the story forward into new forms, new worlds, new lives. For you, drifting now with this thought, there is comfort in knowing that change is not chaos, but rhythm, the same rhythm that moved Pangea, moves still beneath your feet, shaping the world you inhabit. And just as no stone could resist it, no storm could stop it, so too does every change hold its place within a larger flow. The earth teaches patience, impermanence, and the quiet power of what moves unseen. Soon, we will walk closer to the fractures themselves and watch as the supercontinent begins to split. But for now, let this thought linger. Even the greatest unities carry within them the seeds of their own parting, carried forward by the heartbeat of the restless earth. From the steady pulse of the restless earth, the story rises once more to the surface, where silence began to whisper of change. Pangea, so vast, so unified, seemed from above like an eternal whole. But within its heart and along its endless coasts, cracks were quietly forming, almost invisible at first, yet undeniable over the ages. The ground stretched, pulled in opposite directions by forces deep beneath. What seemed solid stone began to thin, to bow, to yield. Rift valleys opened like seams in fabric, subtle at first but deepening, lengthening, hinting at a future where this unity could no longer hold. A rift valley is not born with a single break, but with a long tension, a patient unraveling. Imagine walking across the broad plains of Pangea and noticing that the earth itself sloped downward into a trough. Here the crust had begun to pull apart, sagging as molten rock pressed from below. In time, rivers might have found these paths, flowing into the low places, filling them with lakes. The air there would have carried the scent of minerals rising from below, a faint trace of the fire hidden beneath stone. The earth was whispering, not in words, but in movements that only deep time could translate. These rifts stretched across the land like quiet promises of separation. Along the coasts, too, the whispers could be heard. There, the supercontinent's edges began to thin, the crust pulling gently outward, as though preparing to open into new oceans. Small volcanic ridges sometimes rose in these zones, spilling lava that cooled into dark stone, stitching over the wound, yet never quite closing it. With each eruption, with each tremor, the land seemed to announce its future. It would not remain one forever. Perhaps if you stood there, the change would not frighten you, for it would be too slow, too gentle. The cracks did not rip the land in a single lifetime. They stretched imperceptibly, widening by inches across centuries. Plants grew in their shadows. Animals walked unknowing above them. Life went on as though nothing were changing, and yet the cracks were there, lengthening with every beat of the Earth's molten heart. Pangea's unity was already loosening, even as its deserts stretched wide and its mountains stood high. The rifts themselves were strange landscapes, deep valleys with steep cliffs on either side, their floors sometimes sinking lower than the seas, though no ocean yet rushed to claim them. Lakes glittered in their depths, long and narrow, like mirrors of what would one day become oceans. Volcanic cones sometimes marked their length, rising like sentinels to remind any watcher that fire lay close beneath. Insects might have buzzed through forests near their edges, reptiles skittering across the stone, unaware that the ground beneath them was in the earliest stages of drifting apart. It is humbling to think that all the continents we know today, Africa, the Americas, Asia, Europe, began as whispers like these, as fractures barely noticed in the silence of a world still whole. A single seam would become the Atlantic Ocean. Another would stretch into the Indian Ocean. Yet in their earliest hours, they were only subtle cracks, narrow valleys, small lakes, ordinary landscapes masking extraordinary futures. The Earth has always spoken this way, gently, patiently, with a voice so slow it requires imagination to hear. The rifts of Pangea were sentences in that deep language, words written not in ink but in stone. If one could read them, they said, nothing remains forever joined, not even the greatest land ever gathered. This was not cruelty nor violence, but transformation unfolding with immense care. The land was preparing to drift apart, not suddenly, but in a way that allowed forests to grow, rivers to flow, and life to adapt. There is a philosophy hidden here too. Unity is not a prison, nor is separation a tragedy. Each is a phase in a greater rhythm. Just as a seed must split for a plant to grow, just as clouds must part for rain to fall, so too must continents crack in order for new worlds to emerge. The fractures of Pangea were not only signs of ending, but of beginning. Of seas that would one day cradle coastlines, of habitats that would host new creatures, of climates that would shape the story of life anew. For you, drifting with this thought, there is reassurance. The Earth teaches that change begins quietly, often unnoticed, like cracks that take lifetimes to widen. What feels like a fracture is sometimes only the start of something larger, something unfolding beyond our sight. The rifts of Pangea remind us that even endings can be gentle, carrying within them the seeds of creation. Soon, those cracks would widen, seas would begin to seep into them, and the unity of Pangea would yield to drifting fragments. But here, in the first fractures, we witness the soft beginnings of separation. The Earth breathing its promise that even the mightiest whole would one day give way to the beauty of many. Carrying the thought of those first fractures onward, the story drifts toward the moment when water found its way into the cracks. What began as valleys and lowlands, as scars across the supercontinent, slowly invited rivers and rains to gather. Lakes pooled in the troughs of rift valleys, their surfaces glittering like small mirrors of the sky. Over ages beyond counting, the weight of water deepened the wounds, widening them further, until at last, the sea itself began to seep in. The land that had once stood unbroken started to welcome tides. It was the quiet beginning of new oceans. The Atlantic Ocean, that vast expanse we know today, began not as an endless horizon, but as a trickle. Imagine a narrow channel, water slipping in like a guest through an open door. It did not roar or surge at first, but whispered along the fractures, filling them step by step. With every tide, with every rainfall, the rift valleys stretched wider, their stony walls softened by the persistent embrace of water. In this way, the land surrendered gently, allowing the seas to claim corridors that had waited patiently beneath the weight of stone. This was water's patient artistry. It did not conquer the land in violence, but in slow insistence. Rivers became straits, lakes became gulfs, and in time, those gulfs widened into oceans. The edges of continents, once touching, grew apart as molten rock rose between them, cooling into new seabeds that stretched outward. The Atlantic floor was being born in darkness, lava cooling beneath unseen waters, while above, waves traced the shape of a future coastline. Perhaps to walk there then would have been to see landscapes half-claimed, where salt water lapped against stone still raw from splitting. Bays stretched into the interior, creating new climates, new rhythms of tide and storm. The sound of waves would have echoed along cliffs that had never known the sea before, a fresh music rising in places that once lay deep within the heart of Pangea. The earth was rewriting its boundaries, and water was the ink. Other oceans, too, found their birth in this slow unraveling. The Tethys Sea widened where Asia and Africa began to drift apart, a glittering expanse that once carried life forms long vanished, whose traces we now find in stone. The Indian Ocean waited its turn, forming from another seam, and the Southern Ocean gathered below as Antarctica crept away. Each fracture was answered by water, each valley filled, until the singular continent became a mosaic of land divided by seas. The metaphor is clear, though it unfolds gently. Water claims its corridors as time claims all things. Just as memory seeps into silence, just as cracks in thought widen into new understandings, so too did the seas seep into Pangea. The Atlantic, the Indian, the Southern, all of them whispers at first, growing into voices that would one day roar with storms and swell with tides. What was once one world of land became a world of many shores. For the creatures of that age, this change must have been felt slowly. Forests near the coasts gave way to marshes, marshes to shallow seas. Reptiles that once roamed inland now found new wetlands to inhabit. Fish moved into corridors that deepened year by year, their habitats stretching farther, their migrations widening. The landscape itself was learning to breathe differently, its rhythms tied now to the moon and the pull of tides. Life adapted, as it always does, to the shifting stage beneath it. There is a strange beauty in imagining the first waves of the Atlantic lapping into Pangea. To us, oceans seem eternal, vast and permanent, but each one had a birth. Each one was once a fracture, a thin channel of water cutting across a landmass. The Atlantic's immensity hides its delicate beginnings. Perhaps if you, drifting in thought now, could stand at its earliest shore, you would see only a narrow gulf, a young sea with edges close enough to glimpse across. You might not believe it would grow into an ocean spanning the globe, yet time would prove it so. The philosophy here is quiet, but insistent. Nothing vast was always vast. Oceans, mountains, forests, all begin small, as whispers, as fractures, as trickles of water filling stone corridors. The Atlantic itself reminds us that patience can transform the smallest change into something immeasurable. And just as the supercontinent gave way to seas, so too do the boundaries of our lives shift, sometimes slowly, sometimes without our noticing, until we find ourselves in a new world entirely. As the waters spread and the continents drifted further apart, the unity of Pangea dimmed. The age of one Earth was fading, replaced by a new chapter of many lands, many seas, many climates. And with each tide that rolled into the widening fractures, the future drew nearer, the dawn of the world as we know it, stitched not as one, but as many. The fractures had widened. Water had entered. The great continent that once held the world together was no longer a single body, but a drifting puzzle of stone. And yet, to speak of Pangea's breaking is not to tell a tale of loss alone. It is to speak of rhythm, of the slow turning of ages, of Earth's long song, forever shifting, forever remaking itself. Geology is time carved into stone. Each mountain that rises, each ocean that spreads, is not a fixed event, but a verse in a poem that has no ending. Rocks hold the memory of fire, seas carry the memory of stone. Forests grow from the remains of forests long gone. The earth does not stand still, and never has. To live upon it is to live inside a story of constant change. All things join, all things part. That refrain runs like a current beneath the history of the planet. Continents fuse and drift apart. Rivers cut through valleys, then vanish into deserts. Volcanoes rise, then wear down into plains. Even the sky above has shifted, stars rearranging their constellations across unthinkable spans of time. What seems permanent to us, an ocean, a mountain, a continent, exists only in a chapter, never the whole book. The age of Pangea was one such chapter. It was not the first supercontinent, nor will it be the last. Before it, there had been others. Rodinia, Gondwana, Columbia. Each vast, each seemingly eternal, each eventually surrendered to the slow drift of plates. After Pangea, another will come. Hundreds of millions of years from now, the continents we know will once again creep back together, forming a new world, a new name, a new whole. That is Earth's rhythm. Gathering, parting, gathering again. Time flows not only forward but outward, like ripples on water. To stand inside one ripple is to believe it is the whole lake. But step back, step deep into the scale of geology, and you see countless ripples overlapping, shaping one another. Ice ages cool the globe, then retreat. Forests surge, deserts spread, seas advance and withdraw. Each cycle feels complete, yet each is only part of the larger turning. The breaking of Pangea was one such turning, one more shift in the unending dance. The continents, as they moved apart, carried life with them. Plants and animals rode the drifting rafts of land, isolated in new climates, forced to adapt, to evolve. Here again, the refrain: all things join, all things part. Species flourish, diversify, then vanish. New forms take their place. Extinction and creation are partners in this rhythm, as inseparable as the tides themselves. In the aftermath of Pangea, life blossomed in unexpected ways, scattered into niches that could only exist because the land had split. What was a fracture for the Earth was opportunity for life. Perhaps that is the quiet lesson. What seems an ending is often a beginning concealed. The sundering of a continent brought forth new seas, new climates, new life. The departure of one age became the foundation for the next. Change is not an interruption of Earth's story. It is the story. And yet, we humans often resist this truth. We crave permanence. We seek to hold things still, to imagine the present as fixed. But the Earth whispers otherwise. It shows us, through its stones and seas, that permanence is an illusion. What stands today will someday shift. What feels unbreakable will fracture. What is fractured may one day rejoin. All things join. All things part. To gaze at a world map now is to see echoes of that rhythm. The jagged coastlines of Africa and South America still fit together, like halves of a memory. Fossils found on distant shores speak of animals that once roamed freely across a single land. Rocks tell the story of climates that no longer exist. The Earth remembers even when we forget, holding the past in the curve of its mountains, in the depth of its ocean trenches, in the sediments of its riverbeds. But the story of Pangea left more than geological echoes. It left a kind of parable, one we can carry inward. To live is also to experience joining and parting. Families gather and disperse. Friendships begin, transform, fade, or return. Civilizations rise, flourish, fracture, and leave behind traces of their passing. Just as continents shift, so too do the shapes of our lives. Geology becomes a mirror of existence. What is true of stone is true of us. We are always becoming, always breaking, and reforming. The trickle that began the Atlantic reminds us that even the smallest change may grow vast, if given time. The drifting of continents reminds us that separations need not be final, only phases in a longer rhythm. And so, as the age of Pangea faded, a new age emerged. Oceans widened, climates shifted, life evolved, and the face of Earth remade itself once again. The wheel turned, as it always does. All things join, all things part. And still, the story was not finished. For the echo of Pangea's breaking carried forward. It shaped the lands where we live now, the currents of the seas that cradle our coasts, the winds that sweep across our fields. It shaped the stage upon which humanity itself would one day appear. And though that continent is gone, its memory endures, etched into stone, whispered by waves, traced in the very outlines of the globe we hold in our hands. But the story of Pangea left echoes. The land had drifted, the seas had risen, and the outlines of the world had been redrawn. What once seemed immovable, the very bones of the earth itself, had shifted like a pattern in sand. From that story comes a quiet lesson, one that humbles every creature who walks upon this restless planet. Nothing stays, not even continents. The supercontinent of Pangea appeared to be an unshakable monument, a vast empire of stone stretching from horizon to horizon. For tens of millions of years it endured, an expanse so large that no single age of creatures could comprehend its boundaries. And yet, the mantle beneath it kept moving, patient, tireless. The cracks formed, water entered, stone pulled away from stone. What once was whole became many. If even the greatest landmass Earth ever assembled could not hold forever, what then of anything smaller? What of our cities, our cultures, our own fleeting lives? The Earth, without intention but with unwavering rhythm, reminds us of impermanence. The mountains we climb will one day erode. The rivers we follow will change course. The coastlines we build upon will be reshaped. Nothing is immune to the long patience of time. Perhaps this is not tragedy, but clarity. Change is not a flaw in the story of existence. It is the story. Continents join, then drift. Species flourish, then vanish. Civilizations rise, then fade into echoes. So too with us as individuals. We begin, we grow, we change, we pass. To wish it otherwise would be to wish against the nature of the world itself. And yet, there is comfort in this rhythm. For what breaks also makes way for what is new. Had Pangea never fractured, the seas that now cradle so much of life would not exist. Ecosystems would not have spread into the niches that gave rise to countless new forms. Even the landscapes we call home, green valleys, coastal plains, high mountains, are children of that breaking. Impermanence births possibility. So too in our own lives. The endings we resist often open the door to beginnings we could not yet see. A friendship that drifts leaves space for another connection. A chapter that closes in silence makes way for a new voice. The loss of one season, however painful, plants the seed for another. Change, unwelcome though it may sometimes feel, is the constant through which growth becomes possible. It is tempting to ask what might have been had Pangea endured. Would life have followed the same path? Would the rise of mammals, of primates, of humans have come to pass? We cannot know. The Earth does not reveal such alternatives. But in the wondering itself, we glimpse something profound. The awareness that reality is one choice among many that could have been. Every drift of stone, every shift of sea, every turn of chance has shaped this precise moment. We are living in the singular outcome of endless change, and still, we wonder what might have been. That wondering is part of our nature. It is the echo of impermanence inside the human heart. To reflect on what was, to imagine what could have been, is a way of acknowledging the fragility of our own place in time. But perhaps it is also a way of deepening gratitude for what is. For had the land not broken, had the oceans not risen, we would not stand where we do, gazing upon a world of vast diversity, beauty, and mystery. Impermanence, then, is not a lesson to fear but a truth to carry gently. Just as continents drift, so do the seasons of our lives. We are part of the same rhythm, part of the same story. To live well may not be to resist change, but to move with it, to honor what has joined, to accept what must part, and to remain open to the forms that follow. In this way, the Earth becomes both teacher and mirror. It shows us that nothing stays fixed, but that in the unfolding, New beauty is always being shaped. To hold too tightly is to miss the quiet miracle of becoming. To let go is to join the current of time itself, flowing as the continents once flowed, carried toward horizons we cannot yet see. The story of Pangea does not end in ruin. It ends in transformation, and from that transformation, the Earth we know was born. And still, we wonder what might have been. From the quiet recognition that nothing stays, not even continents, the story bends toward the traces left behind. What broke apart did not vanish without a mark. Instead, the Earth offered scattered reminders, fragments of memory embedded in stone. These are the fossils, pressed into layers of time like pages in a diary. And though oceans now divide the lands that once touched, those fragments whisper the truth of their union. In the dry soils of South America, in the weathered rocks of southern Africa, in the windswept stretches of India and Antarctica, the same ancient leaf appears again and again. Glossopteris, a fern-like plant with tongue-shaped leaves, delicate yet persistent, flourishing across Pangea in the late Paleozoic. Its imprint is simple, the ghost of veins etched into stone, yet its reach is astonishing. How could such a plant appear on continents now separated by vast seas? Only by remembering that these continents were once neighbors, joined in the embrace of a single land. Science, in this way, becomes a keeper of memory. The Earth does not write its story in words, but in patterns repeated across distance. Fossils are the connective tissue, the evidence that what we see as divided was once whole. To trace a plant fossil in India and find its twin in Brazil is to touch the seam of a long-vanished world. Each discovery bridges oceans not with ships or cables, but with time itself. The Glossopteris is not alone. Alongside it lie the bones of reptiles whose range stretched across the supercontinent. Lystrosaurus, a squat creature with tusks, walked from what is now Africa into what is now Asia without ever crossing an ocean. Mesosaurus, a slender reptile, swam in freshwater lakes that later split into opposite shores. Their remains, separated now by water, testify to a time when rivers ran without interruption across the heart of Pangea. For the early scientists of the 19th and 20th centuries, these fossils were puzzle pieces scattered across a broken map. How could identical species exist an ocean apart? Some imagined improbable bridges of land now sunken beneath the waves. Others suggested coincidences of evolution. Yet the fossils themselves, quiet and unassuming, resisted those explanations. They carried the truth more clearly than human imagination allowed at first. The continents had once been joined, and only their drifting apart scattered the creatures' remains. There is something deeply reassuring in this, that even as mountains crumble and seas expand, the Earth finds ways of remembering itself. Stone holds onto memory in silence, waiting for hands to uncover it, for minds to connect the shapes. In that sense, science is less about conquest and more about listening, about recognizing the whispers left by ancient life and trusting that they tell us something essential about belonging. Perhaps you, drifting now, can picture one of those Glossopteris leaves pressed between rocks. Imagine it falling from a tree hundreds of millions of years ago, floating briefly on a river, settling gently into mud. Layer after layer of sediment covered it, until pressure turned mud to shale and leaf to fossil. Now, long after continents split and oceans rolled between them, someone kneels and brushes away the dust, finding that quiet imprint. A leaf that once shaded a reptile or caught the breath of wind is still here, bridging past and present. The thought is humbling, that the Earth remembers what we cannot and offers those memories back to us in fragments. Fossils across oceans remind us not only that the continents were united, but also that unity always leaves traces, no matter how far apart the pieces drift. And so, when we gaze across the Atlantic, or read the outlines of Africa mirrored faintly in the coast of South America, we are not merely imagining. We are seeing the echo of truth confirmed in stone. Fossils keep the memory alive, anchoring imagination in evidence. They are both proof and poetry, scientific fact and metaphor for how all things remain connected, even when divided. Soon, we will look at other echoes of that unity. Mountains that still carry the scars of collision, and currents in the oceans that trace the broken edges of Pangea. But for now, let this thought rest with you gently, that the Earth, in its patient way, never forgets. Even when lands pull apart, it leaves reminders folded in stone, quiet testaments that what once was joined can never be entirely lost. Carrying the memory of fossils forward, the story rises toward stone that still stands above the Earth, though softened by time. Where continents once collided, the scars remain, lifted high into ridges and folded ranges that mark the meeting of ancient lands. These mountains are not new, not sharp as the Himalayas or jagged as the Andes, but they are older, wiser, softened like the face of an elder who has lived through countless seasons. They are timekeepers, bearing in their bones the memory of Pangea. The Appalachians in North America whisper of that union. Today, they are cloaked in forests, rounded hills stretching gently across the eastern edge of a continent. Travelers walk their trails and feel them as calm landscapes, rich with autumn colors or spring blossoms. But once, hundreds of millions of years ago, they stood as towering peaks, rivaling the young ranges of today. They were raised when Africa pressed into North America, when continents collided to weave the supercontinent together. What we now see as hills and ridges were once the spines of giants. Across the ocean, the Urals extend from the frozen edges of the Arctic down toward the heart of Asia. They, too, are remnants of that great union, formed when Siberia and Europe pressed against one another. Their ridges, wrapped in snow and tundra, are monuments to collision. To walk among them is to step across the seam where worlds once fused. Each stone is a page in the diary of Earth, written in the language of uplift and erosion, of fire beneath and weather above. And in northern Africa, the Atlas Mountains rise against desert skies. Their presence is quieter, their outlines softened by time, yet they, too, are echoes of the same story. They tell of pressures beneath the crust, of plates driven together until the land folded upward. Though wind and rain have carved them down, though dunes gather at their feet, they remain, timekeepers holding memory in their enduring silhouettes. To imagine these ranges in their youth is to glimpse a very different Earth. The Appalachians stretching sharp and snow-capped, the Urals forming a backbone across the great sweep of Pangea, the Atlas standing newly heaved, their valleys uncarved, their peaks piercing clouds. Storms gathered around them, rivers poured down their sides, and creatures wandered their foothills. They were not yet softened by patience. They were bold, restless, and immense. Now, they are quieter, worn by countless rains, their sharpness rounded into gentleness. In this softening lies their lesson. Mountains do not vanish quickly. They endure long after the seas shift and continents part, but even they yield to time. Even giants fall asleep. What once scraped the sky now rests beneath moss and forest, beneath snow that drifts quietly across their slopes. Perhaps you can picture them this way. Sleeping giants, stretched across the land, their breathing so slow it is measured in ages. Their silence is not emptiness, but patience. In their slopes, one can read the rhythm of impermanence. They rise with violence, they stand with pride, they bow with humility. All things, even the hardest stone, pass through this cycle. The presence of these mountains today is also a reassurance. They are proof that what we cannot see with our eyes still leaves marks. The continents that once joined into Pangea are long divided, but the places where they struck each other still stand, even if softened. Each peak, each ridge, is a memorial of a vanished age, reminding us that the world is older and more connected than our brief lives reveal. You, drifting now, may think of your own moments of collision, the times when lives meet, when forces greater than yourself press upon you. They may feel overwhelming, shaping you with sharp edges, but as the mountains show, time softens even the harshest collisions. The memory remains, but it becomes something quieter, something enduring rather than breaking. Soon, we will wander further into these echoes, the seas shaped by Pangea's parting, the currents that still follow its lines. But for now, rest with the thought of mountains as timekeepers, witnesses who do not speak but still remember. They stand, softened but enduring, whispering across ages that even the greatest collisions are folded gently into the rhythm of change. From the softened slopes of ancient mountains, the story turns outward toward the restless surfaces of sea and sky. For even though stone is patient and enduring, water and air are ceaseless travelers, forever moving, forever reshaping the face of the earth. When Pangea stretched across the globe, it did not only bind continents together, it reshaped oceans, it redirected winds, it set in motion the patterns that still echo in our world today. Picture the supercontinent in its vastness, with one immense ocean wrapping around it. That ocean, known as Panthalassa, stretched almost unbroken, an expanse so large it is nearly beyond imagining. Its waters moved as a single restless body, swirling in gyres, rolling with currents driven by sun and wind. At Pangea's edges, the waves crashed against endless coasts, while in its center, the land blocked and redirected the movements of both water and air. Currents are the lifeblood of oceans, carrying heat, carrying salt, carrying the memory of climate across hemispheres. In the age of Pangea, these currents took forms unlike today's. With one ocean dominating the globe, their pathways circled vast loops, uninterrupted by chains of continents. Heat from the equator spread differently, traveling far into polar regions before curling back again. Some scientists imagine that these immense loops made climate more extreme, hotter near the equator, colder toward the poles, while others suggest the vastness smoothed temperature across great distances. Perhaps both were true, in different regions at different times. When the continents began to separate, when new oceans formed, the currents broke into smaller systems. The Atlantic opened and began to circulate its own gyres. The Indian Ocean carved out patterns of monsoons. The Pacific, though still enormous, gained boundaries and divided flows. Yet within all these movements lies the echo of Pangea, the way water moves today, the way winds carry moisture across the globe, still bears the fingerprints of that ancient arrangement. You might think of the Gulf Stream, carrying warmth from the Caribbean across the Atlantic, tempering the winters of Europe. Its existence depends on the Atlantic Basin, a child of Pangea's fracture. Or think of the monsoons, the seasonal winds that drench South Asia, drawn by the pull of land and sea, formed in the wake of Pangea's parting. The very weather that shapes human history is linked to choices made long before humans appeared. Choices written not by intent, but by the slow drift of continents. Perhaps the most haunting thought is that even the winds we feel today, The storms that gather, the breezes that cross open plains, are heirs to that supercontinent. When land is united, winds circle it differently than when seas split it apart. The jet streams, the wandering bands of high-altitude air, were once bent and curved by the outline of Pangea. Now, with continents scattered, they follow other paths, but the memory remains, hidden in the mathematics of climate, in the pulse of seasons. Imagine standing on one of Pangea's coasts, feeling a steady wind that had traveled thousands of miles across a single ocean. That wind would carry the scent of salt, the memory of storms, the coolness of distant polar waters. Today, our winds often shift and turn as they pass across land and sea. But then, they may have moved with greater persistence, steady voices whispering across unbroken water. You, drifting now, may think of how winds and currents are like thoughts in a human life. They move unseen, carrying warmth or chill, shifting with barriers, redirected by changes in terrain. Sometimes they are gentle, sometimes fierce, sometimes they circle endlessly before finding release. And just as the winds today bear echoes of Pangea, so too our present selves bear currents of past choices, patterns laid down long before. Soon we will move into other echoes, the marks left in philosophy, in memory, in the quiet way humans seek permanence in an impermanent world. But before that, let the thought rest here, that even the breeze on your cheek, even the waves lapping against today's shores, are part of a story written when all land was one. The age of Pangea is gone, yet its currents and winds continue, reminding us that nothing ever fully disappears. It only changes form, carrying the past forward in ceaseless motion, carrying that thought onward. Let us sink into the quiet patience of stone, for in the slow turning of Earth's layers, memory is not lost, but simply stored in a different language. A diary lies beneath every step, though its words are not written in ink or carved in letters, but pressed into minerals, folded into ridges, and sealed in strata. Time remembers, even if faintly. It remembers in the tilt of a pebble, in the ripple of sandstone, in the crystalline glow of a vein formed under heat and weight, long before a human eye could have dreamed of noticing. Stone is Earth's memory, and like all memories, it is fragmented, weathered, sometimes half erased, but never entirely gone. The mountains themselves may crumble, rivers may wash away entire valleys, yet beneath, in quiet seams and layers, the record continues. A core drilled from Antarctic ice recalls recent millennia of air and snowfall. But stone reaches deeper, holding whispers not of centuries, but of epochs. The very bedrock beneath cities, fields, and oceans holds stories of collisions and separations, of seas that once stretched where deserts now stand, of forests turned to coal and coral turned to limestone cliffs. Time remembers, even if faintly. Consider shale, born from compacted mud at the bottom of forgotten seas. Each thin sheet, fragile and layered, is a page written by still waters. Within its folds, one might find the faint outline of a trilobite, an animal gone for hundreds of millions of years, yet here it lingers like a pressed flower. Or think of granite, forged from molten depths, cooling slowly, patiently, until its crystals grew visible, each one a slow punctuation in the story of fire becoming stone. Time remembers, even if faintly. In the way continents fit like puzzle pieces, stone keeps track of their once united form. Rocks of the same type and age, now found oceans apart, still whisper their kinship. The basalt of India's Deccan Traps shares its fiery story with basalt in Brazil, echoing eruptions that once reshaped climates and redefined the course of life. Coal beds in the northern hemisphere mirror those in the southern, evidence of swampy forests that once spread across Pangea's equatorial belt. These materials do not speak loudly. They require patience, translation, and humility. But once heard, their chorus is unmistakable. Time remembers in layers of limestone formed from creatures too small for the naked eye. Tiny shells settled gently, grain upon grain, until they became whole mountains. Millions of years of lives, too brief to notice, now endure as cliffs and caverns. When you pass your hand along the wall of a canyon or trace the cool roughness of a rock face, you are, in some way, running your fingers along Earth's journal. Each groove is a sentence, each mineral a word. Time remembers, even if faintly. The memory of stone also carries silence. Not every story is preserved. Some chapters are missing, torn out by erosion, rewritten by fire, folded under tectonic weight until the words can no longer be read. Geologists call these absences unconformities, gaps in the record where entire ages vanish. Yet even in absence, there is memory. A missing layer speaks of rivers carving too quickly, or seas withdrawing too suddenly for sediments to gather. The blank spaces are not nothingness. They are reminders that even memory has pauses, silences between notes. And here, in this silence, one might reflect on the nature of memory itself. Human memory fades and reshapes, yet fragments endure. The smell of rain, the sound of a voice, the warmth of a childhood afternoon. Earth's memory behaves similarly. Most details are lost, yet certain imprints cling. A fern leaf pressed into shale, a ripple pattern frozen in sandstone, a fossil shell preserved in marble. These are not the fullness of the past, but enough to remind us it was once real. Time remembers, even if faintly. The metaphor of stone as diary extends into philosophy. To imagine a rock is to imagine patience. It holds its memory without urgency, without expectation of being read. The stone is indifferent to whether we understand, yet it preserves all the same. And in this indifference, there is reassurance. For you, drifting now, it means that nothing is entirely erased. Even if forgotten by people, the world itself holds traces. The air you breathe, the ground beneath you, the materials of your home. Each was once part of another chapter, another landscape, another story written in the book of stone. Sometimes, in caves, stalactites and stalagmites rise and descend slowly, drip by drip, creating their own archives. Their bands, like the rings of trees, record shifts in climate, droughts, floods, and temperatures of forgotten centuries. Even water, passing through rock, becomes an author of memory. The quiet growth of crystal by crystal is like ink, dropping slowly, steadily, until words appear over ages. Time remembers, even if faintly. And what of the great mountain ranges? Their jagged edges may suggest youth, yet within their cores lie rocks older than imagination. The Himalayas, though young in shape, are built from seabeds raised skyward, their fossils now dwelling above the clouds. The Appalachians, softened by weathering, still bear the scars of ancient collisions when continents locked together to form Pangea. Each ridge and fold is an entry in Earth's journal, carved not with pen, but with pressure. Soon, we might consider how even the winds and waters carry echoes of these shifts, how the memory of unity shapes the movements of air and sea. But for now, let us rest with the stones themselves, their stillness, their weight, their enduring patience. If you are drifting, know that the ground holds you as gently as it holds the echoes of worlds gone before. Time remembers, even if faintly, and in that remembrance there is comfort, for nothing vanishes entirely into silence. It only changes form, waiting quietly, like a diary kept beneath the moss and snow. Now, as the journey of stone and ocean, of winds and drifting continents, settles into quiet, let us turn inward to you, the traveler of time who has wandered with these stories. You have drifted across oceans that no longer touch, walked mountains that once were whole, listened to fossils and currents that whispered across epochs. And though these tales belong to the earth, they also belong to you. For within your body, within your breath, lie traces of the same matter, the same history, the same endurance. You are not apart from this deep story. You are part of it. You carry the strength of those who came before. It is easy to think of time as something we move through, a river carrying us downstream. But tonight, as you rest, imagine instead that time moves through you, flowing like wind through branches, like tides along a shore. Every cell of your being is a witness to a continuity stretching far beyond memory. The calcium in your bones once belonged to seashells, long dissolved and reborn. The iron in your blood was forged in stars that lived and died before Earth itself was shaped. You are, in truth, a living archive. You carry the strength of those who came before. In quiet reflection, consider how the Earth remembers through stone, and how you, too, remember in ways that cannot always be spoken. Your memories are not written in fossils or granite, but in the gentle traces of moments lived. A voice, a smile, a horizon once seen at dusk. Time remembers, even if faintly, and so do you. Nothing is ever fully lost. It simply finds another form, another way to endure. Just as the mountains sleep beneath moss, so your memories rest within you, softened but still present, still holding. Perhaps you wonder, as many do, what it would have been like to walk upon Pangea, that single vast continent where deserts stretched without end, where forests of strange plants grew unbroken, where rivers wound across distances too great to fathom. Perhaps you imagine looking up at a night sky, seeing stars unshaken by the lights of cities, a silence broken only by wind and water, and the calls of creatures long vanished. The question lingers gently, like a leaf floating upon still water. What was Earth like during Pangea? It is a question without a full answer, for the diary of stone can only whisper fragments. Yet there is beauty in the silence that follows such wondering, for not knowing allows space to dream, to drift, to imagine yourself wandering across that primeval land. Perhaps you picture yourself sitting beside a Glossopteris tree, its leaves broad and strange, watching a river that will one day become a mountain ridge. Perhaps you walk among creatures whose bones will fossilize into the very stones geologists now study. Perhaps you are simply still, listening to the earth as it was, as it might be remembered. And as the thought fades, there is comfort in knowing that such questions do not need immediate answers. They can rest, like stones beneath snow, waiting. You do not need to hold them tightly. You may let them drift into silence. The earth remembers for you. Time remembers, even if faintly. So rest now, traveler of time. Let the weight of these stories soften into ease. Let the rivers of thought run slowly. Then still, you have wandered through epochs tonight, carried by currents and winds, guided by mountains and fossils, accompanied by the patient memory of stone. You have carried the question with you, and now you may set it down, like a traveler laying aside a satchel at the end of a long road. In this stillness, feel the continuity that enfolds you. The world does not ask for urgency. It does not demand answers. It simply holds you, as it has held all before you. The soil that bore forests and deserts also supports your rest. The oceans that once encircled Pangea echo now in your veins. The mountains that once rose sharp and fierce remind you that endurance often softens into gentleness, and through it all, you remain part of the story. One breath in a vast lineage, one moment in the long patience of time. You carry the strength of those who came before. If you are drifting, know that it is enough to drift. You do not need to arrive anywhere tonight. You do not need to resolve the mysteries of continents or the riddles of deep time. You only need to rest within the comfort that even in silence, the earth remembers. And so do you. Questions can remain open. Thoughts can linger without answers. Wonder itself is a form of belonging. Let your breathing match the slow rhythm of the earth. Inhale, as if gathering the quiet of ancient forests. Exhale, as if releasing the dust of distant mountains. Feel yourself belonging not to one moment, but to all moments. Not to one place, but to the whole turning world. And as your thoughts grow lighter, let the final reassurance sink gently into you. You carry the strength of those who came before. Their endurance is in your blood, their patience in your bones, their quiet resilience in the rhythm of your heart. You are never alone in time, for you are woven of time itself. So now, let go of the question. Let it dissolve softly into the silence of night. What was Earth like during Pangea? The Earth remembers. Time remembers, even if faintly. You may rest. You may drift. You may dream. Sleep well, traveler.